Welcome to Goofy Harry. Today's adventure. What if Harry Potter was stolen by Lady Hell of the Norse Underworld? If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The house at Godric's Hollow. The night was warm for the end of October, and that was the first wrong thing. Cats yawned along garden walls in Godric's Hollow. Pumpkins had been set out, and candles inside them, and a gaggle of small witches and wizards in homemade costumes had passed through the lane an hour before, trailing wrappers and laughter. The cottage at the end of the lane was lit in two of its windows and dark in the rest. Smoke from the chimney went up in a narrow rope and frayed against the moon. Inside, James Potter was on the floor of the sitting room with a wand in his hand and no shoes on. He had been chasing a stag of blue light around for the entertainment of his son, who liked the way it bobbed against the ceiling, and he had not yet replaced the shoes after the chase. The stag was still wandering, as patient and aimless as any conjured thing left to its own devices, and Lily Potter had laughed once and told her husband he was a child himself, which had been kind, and James had said yes, but a tall one, which had been true. Upstairs, the baby's room had a mobile with little tin owls on it that turned by no breath the windows admitted. The cot was painted white. The cot's blanket had been knitted by a greytant who was not a witch and did not know that her godson would one day be very famous indeed, and only briefly. The blanket had a thread on it that would not stay tucked. Harry had pulled at it this evening with great seriousness and great failure. The wards on the cottage had been laid with skill. The Fadelius had been laid with love. Both had been betrayed in an afternoon for a number of reasons that came down in the end to fear, and now the door of the cottage opened with a click of mechanism and not a whisper of working, and a man in a hood walked in over the threshold the wards had been told to admit. He did not knock. He did not announce. He had not been a guest in any house for a long time. James said, "Lily, take Harry, go," and rose with his wand at the ready, and was killed in the next breath. He fell across the rug. He did not cry out. There was a quality to the stillness afterward that the cottage took in like breath. Lily had Harry already. She went up the stairs with her son's name in her mouth and her wand left forgotten on the kitchen counter where it had been last set down to peel an apple. Some things go that way. Some things will not stop, no matter how cleanly the prophecy has been laid out for the participants. She locked the nursery door, which was useless, and she set Harry down in the cot, which was almost useless, and she stood between her child and the door, which was the only thing she had left. The man in the hood broke the door with a word and entered. "Stand aside, girl," said the voice that had eaten itself thin to fit so much hate. "Stand aside and you may live." She did not stand aside. She had not been raised to. She had a mind for figures and a soft mouth and a temper she did not always govern, and she would not be moved. She talked. She said things that meant please and things that meant don't and things that meant my son in 3 different shapes. The man in the hood did not listen because he had already decided. There is a kind of person who does not really hear what comes after they have made up their minds, and Lord Voldemort was such a person, and on Halloween in 1981 it cost him. He killed her with a green light that flexed the room and went away again. She fell with the same lack of cry that her husband had managed, although it was harder for her, because she had something to say and could no longer say it. Voldemort did not see this. He saw a small child sitting up in a cot with a thread of blanket caught around one wrist, and he raised his wand a 3rd time and spoke a word that had only ever traveled in one direction in his hand. It traveled this time in 2. What returned was not green. It was not anything that had a color. It was the unkind feedback of a working that had been built to be unidirectional, meeting a working it had not anticipated. Something in the room had been done that night that no one in that room had quite known they were doing. Something old and slow, and not at all flashy, had been arranged in the moment Lily Potter had decided to die without moving, and that quiet thing had been waiting for the curse to come, and it caught the curse and turned it. The wand in Voldemort's hand kicked back like a gun. The body in the dark robe was scoured out from inside. Something white and thin tore loose from him, and went up through the rafters of the cottage and through the slates and into the night, screaming in a register that did not bother dogs or men, but woke other things further off. Another sliver of the same white material did not go up through the rafters. It tore loose and fell. It fell into the cot. Harry was small. Harry was awake. Harry had a thread in one fist and the other hand reached up at the noise in the air, and the white sliver came down across his forehead like a brand and went in. There was a moment of bright pain, very pure, and then nothing for a long time. The cottage burned in places. Stones cracked. The tin owls on the mobile shed their tin in a hot drift and went around once more and stopped. Harry did not cry. Whether that was because the curse had spent his whole supply of cry on the way through him, or whether it was because he was, even at 1 year old, the sort of person who would later grow up not to make a noise about pain, would be argued by certain quiet historians for years. The mark on his forehead was a thin bright line shaped like a rune that had not been designed by anyone present. The rune knew where it was. The rune sang very faintly inside itself and did not stop. Now, a brief widening. Above the cottage, 3 places noticed at once. The first was the ministry, which had a number of pieces of equipment that pinged when a great working broke loose, and which proceeded, with the stately ineffectiveness of bureaucracies everywhere, to file 3 separate alerts that would not be read until morning. The second was Albus Dumbledore in his tower at Hogwarts, who looked up from a list he had been keeping and put down his quill, and said one word that he kept for occasions when the world had moved without his permission. Then he sent for Hagrid. The third was further away. The third was not in any direction that the ministry's instruments measured, because the third sat across a kind of distance the ministry's instruments had been built to ignore, and the third was in a hall where the floors were stone, and the stone was very cold, and a woman with a face split between living and dying sat on a chair of carved bone and looked up and frowned. She had been bored. This was important. Hel of Helheim, daughter of Loki Laufeyjarson, queen of 9 kindly hells, had been bored for several centuries. The dead came in. The dead were settled. The dead were assigned shades to pass time with, and rivers to drink from, and quiet halls to wait in. The damp arithmetic of unkindled souls moved across her ledgers in the way damp arithmetic moves, slowly, with its own little eddies. She had once liked a war for the sheer change of pace. She had not had a war in a while. Tonight she had felt a cracking somewhere in the laminations between worlds, a working that had eaten its own caster, a soul torn into pieces, a piece that had nowhere to go. The thread of it had dragged across her scrying bowl like fingernails on slate. She had touched the bowl with the half of her face that still had skin and watched the picture form. A cottage in a country whose trees she had never visited, a child sitting up in a cot with no understanding of his own escape, a brand laid into a forehead too small for it. She had thought, almost out loud, well. The Greek halls had felt it too. Hades was a careful sovereign, and his net was wide. He had been mid-game with Persephone, a board of bone and obsidian counters that they did not always finish, because a marriage of their length is best stocked with games that can be set aside, and a runner had come in and whispered. Hades had looked at the runner and said in the tone of a man who has been running an underworld for a long time, "Whose?" The runner had not been able to say. The piece had no domain stamp. The piece had no shepherd. The piece was unclaimed. Persephone had set down her counter. "Mortal Britain," she had said with the mildness of a woman about to be very impatient. "It has the smell of an island. I will go." Hades had nodded. "Send the working a scribe," he had said after a beat. He meant the right that should have caught a soul like that. He had not yet known the part where the soul belonged to a child still alive. By the time Persephone was clad and going, the sliver had been claimed. Hell had moved between hours. She did not pretend to be a kindly thing. She did not arrive in the way her father might have, with the cape of a surprise and a one-liner. She came through the wall of the world in the cottage as cold comes into a house with the door left open, an arrival no one in the room had agreed to. The cottage smelled of smoke and ash and ozone and a fading green. She had to step over a body. She paused because she was not without manners, and she said something in a tongue that the body could no longer hear, and a room over Lily Potter's shade quietly straightened, where she had been waiting, and did not move toward Helheim. Lily had decided where she was going to wait. Hell did not interfere. The cot was at the back of the room. The cot's white paint had darkened in places where heat had blown across it. The mobile was bent and cooling. The child sat up awake with a thread on his wrist and a brand on his forehead that breathed in and out very slightly. Hel of Helheim looked down at the child. Half of her face was lovely. Half of it was bone showing through at the cheek and the jaw. Both of her eyes were the color the sky takes after a great snow. She had been a queen for so long that her looking at a thing was a kind of small ritual. The thing did not always survive. The child looked back, did not flinch. There was nothing here he had not already met, in a lower and shorter form in the dark of his nursery for a long time. She knelt. She let the thread of her cloak settle along the cot rail without disturbing the chimes. "Child," she said, and her voice had the quality of a stone that had been a long time under water, polished and even. "I will not hurt thee. There is something on thy brow that will." She bent closer. The brand on the forehead recoiled from the cool wash of her shadow. It was a sliver of soul. It had been made for an anchor. It had been chained to its parent across the country in a body that was no longer a body. It had not been made to live in this child. It had not been made to live in any child. It was thin and it was furious and it had nowhere to go. She could have unbound it. There were 3 working words she knew that would have lifted it free and burned it on her thumbnail. She did not. Hell's calm had 2 halves like the rest of her. She had lifted her hand to do the unbinding and found in the half-second before she spoke that she had decided differently. She had decided, in fact, several things at once. She had decided that the soul in her care for the night ought not to be wasted. She had decided that the parent of this sliver, when it returned for the bone of him, would find the bone interestingly altered. She had decided that she liked the stillness of the child. She had decided that the Greeks were not coming fast enough. She had decided that Olympus's nursery was full and Asgard's was empty. She had decided, there is a thing you do if you are queen of a kindly hell and you intend to take a thing home that does not, by ordinary accounting, belong to you. You name it ward, you speak the formula, you take responsibility for its bone. She did so. She said the words. The child did not flinch. When she lifted him, the cot creaked a little, as cots do, and the blanket came up with its loose thread, and she folded the blanket around him because she had been a guest in too many cradles not to know what was done. He was warm. He weighed almost nothing. He smelled of smoke and milk. The brand on his forehead breathed. Welcome, said Hel low to the child she now held. Be welcome under the roof of Elgidnir. Be welcome in the lodging of those who were not chosen, and the lodging of those who were. Thou hast come a long way for a small thing. She turned and walked out of the cottage through a door no one would later find a hinge for. The door was not in the cottage's plan. The door was in her plan, the cottage settled. In the hall outside the nursery in Godric's Hollow, James Potter's shade had watched her go. He had been watching from a corner he had not yet learned to leave. Hel had looked at him courteously. Some of the dead noticed her. Most did not. James had seen her quite plainly because he was newly dead and the line was thin. He had not raised his hand to stop her. He had been a young man in love with several things, and he had a face that was made for a certain wide and careless gladness, and he had a mind that had moved very fast in life and had begun, in the half-hour he had been dead, to learn to move differently. He had looked at the half-rotted, half-radiant queen with his boy in her arms, and his shade had rippled, and he had said with a laugh that had nothing to do with mirth, "Take care of him." "I will," Hel of Helheim had said. She did not promise more than that. She did not promise less. Persephone arrived 20 minutes later by Underworld accounting, which is in places longer than mortal time and in places shorter, and which on this night was bad luck. The cottage was empty by then, but for the long dead, and the body of Lily Potter, and the body of the man who had killed her, which had broken open and gone out. Persephone walked with her hands tucked into her sleeves, because the autumn was harder in mortal Britain than her body remembered. She crossed the room and saw the shape of the working in the air the way another might see steam. She was not a woman who lost her temper often. She did not lose it now. She knelt by Lily Potter and said something that made the shade sit up again, briefly, and acknowledge her. Persephone explained that Lily's son had been taken. Persephone explained that he had been taken to a place where, as far as the Queen of Helheim was reputed to keep a household, he would be treated as kin. Persephone added this was Persephone, that she would do her best to ensure that he was returned in a form Lily Potter would have approved of. Lily's shade said, "Thank you," and then said, "He was a baby with a hard head," and then said, "Don't let her forget I was his mother," and then went where she had decided to go, which was where her own mother was waiting in a kitchen in Cokeworth that was not quite a kitchen anymore. Persephone rose. She left the cottage with her hands tucked back into her sleeves. She had a letter to compose. In a hall of dark basalt under a country far to the south, a man on a black throne lifted one finger and stopped a clerk mid-sentence. He had been listening to a report on the disposition of a small flotilla of war dead that had wandered in earlier in the afternoon by way of a misfiled token. He set the report aside. "Repeat that part," said Hades. "About the boy," the clerk repeated. "There was a child. The child had been claimed by Hel of Helheim, daughter of Loki, queen of 9 kindly hells, and the child had been brought home to her hall as a ward." The clerk had it from a runner who had it from a vibration in the floor of the eastern annex. The clerk apologized for the lack of confirmation. Hades did not need confirmation. Hades knew what the floor of the eastern annex did when a soul went sideways across the world, and he had felt this one go. He looked at the obsidian counter still in his hand. He set it down. "My wife," he said, to no one in particular, "is going to be very tedious about this." She was already being tedious about it, in fact, by means of a slab of pale stone and a yew pen, and the tediousness had not yet reached him because Hermes was still in the hallway, and Hermes had not yet been told to deliver. Hades closed his eyes for a moment. He was not a sentimental man. He was not, in any of the older books, even a particularly warm man. He had once been called the receiver of many because the receiving was, in the end, what he did. but he had a sense of order and a sense of jurisdiction and a sense, however inconvenient, that there were certain children for whom certain forms ought to be observed, and the forms had not been observed. "Send to my wife," he said. "Tell her I will sign whatever she sends. Send also to my brother. He will want to bluster. Tell him to bluster modestly. We will get the boy in the end." "In the end, my lord, in the end," said Hades. "Helheim is not a tomb. Helheim is a waiting room. The boy is alive. He will not always be in Helheim. He will eventually be returned to a country we can negotiate over. We will negotiate." The clerk made a note. The clerk had been a clerk for 200 years and had developed certain instincts for what would and what would not require a longer file. He opened a longer file. "My lord," said the clerk, "would my lord care to file a formal protest in the meantime?" Hades considered the question. "My wife will file the formal protest," he said. "Mine will be informal." "Tell my wife I will draft the formal one with her at table tonight. Tell my brother to send a bouquet." "A bouquet, my lord, a bouquet," said Hades. "He will know what I mean." The clerk, who did not know what Hades meant, made another note and went away. Up in the air, across the moor, around the wide unmappable quiet between domains, the news had begun to move. Hermes, who had been at a corner table in a tavern in Athens that did not technically exist, looked at his wine, at the flicker that ran across its surface, and said, "Oh, oh, oh," and stood up so fast he knocked over a god of small rivers. He was halfway to Olympus before the chair finished falling. He had 3 pieces of gossip already arranged in his head, none of them quite accurate, all of them better than the truth. Apollo, lying on a divan with a young person whose name he had not bothered to learn because he had been planning to leave by sunrise anyway, sat up and said, "There has been a poem in the air all evening, and now I see what it was for," and reached for his lyre. He had 4 lines drafted before he had his sandals on. Odin, far north, sitting at the seat from which he saw most things, was told. He was told by a bird. The bird settled on his shoulder and made the small sound it made when matters were grave but not at once urgent. Odin closed his good eye for a long moment. Then he opened it. Said in a voice that carried only as far as he meant it to, "Let her keep him." He did not approve. He did not interfere. He went back to looking at the world. Heimdall, at the bridge that did not always look like a bridge, had seen the whole arc of it. He saw the cottage burn. He saw the mother's last working. He saw hell come and take the child like a coin off a counter. He stood at his post and he watched, and he did not raise the horn. There would be time to raise the horn if it came to that. The choice was not his. Loki was in 3 places at once, and only one of those places matters here. He had been a fly on a sill in a salon in Paris where someone was about to be slighted in a way he had set up with great patience, and he had been a snake under a stone in a hill in Galicia, and he had been Loki in his own face, walking the long, slow corridor between his mother's hall and his daughter's when the news reached him. He stopped. He grinned. He let the grin go away again. He turned around, and he started walking the other way. The fly on the sill in Paris fell off and was eaten by a cat. The snake under the stone went away in a flicker. Loki of Asgard was going to see his daughter. He did not yet know what he would say, but he thought he would say it well. Down in mortal Britain, by the cottage, the lane had begun to fill. Rubeus Hagrid arrived at the gate first, on a flying motorcycle that was not yet his, with his great hands shaking and a basket strapped across his front for the baby he had been told to retrieve. He found James in the sitting room and Lily upstairs, and he sat on the second from the top step of the cottage stairs for a long minute, and his beard collected tears, and he did not yet know that he had no child to retrieve. He climbed up to the nursery and stood at the door. The cot was empty. He stared at the cot for what felt like an hour and was perhaps a minute. He searched the room and the cupboards. He went down the stairs and back up the stairs. He came back inside and sat down on the floor and put his face in his hands. The basket strapped across his front held a wool blanket that smelled of Hogwarts, and that blanket would be sat with for a long time. Sirius Black, who had loved James Potter the way a brother loves a brother and a friend loves a friend and a man loves his life in the body of another, arrived next, and the lane was darker by then and his face was not his own, and he ran into the cottage shouting names the cottage could no longer answer to. He found Hagrid in the nursery on the floor with the empty cot. Sirius said, "Where is he?" Hagrid said, "I don't know." Sirius said, "What do you mean you don't know?" Hagrid said, "He's not here, Sirius. He's gone." Sirius's face did several things at once. The thing it settled on was the face of a man who has been handed both the worst grief he knows and a worse mystery on top of it, and who has resolved, in the half-second between 2 breaths he did not bother to take, to prosecute the worst mystery first. He was already on the stair. He was already out the door. He was already on the motorcycle, which was technically Hagrid's now, and which he had ridden without asking. He flew north because he could not think of anywhere else to fly. He would, in the next 12 hours, do several reasonable things and one terrible one. He would chase Peter Pettigrew across half a county. He would corner Peter on a street in front of Muggle witnesses, and Peter, who had practiced this particular trick for years in case it was needed, would cut off his own finger and explode the street and leave Sirius to be arrested for his own friend's crimes. Sirius would go to Azkaban for 13 years for the murder of 12 people he had not killed and a friend who was not even dead, and the cottage at Godric's Hollow would stand vacant because the boy who had vanished from it was not in any of the places anyone thought to look. In the kitchen of the cottage, on the counter where it had been left, Lily Potter's wand cooled. Outside, the lane filled with more witches and wizards. Word ran like a fire. By morning the names would be known: the fall of Voldemort, the survival of the boy who lived, the end of the war. The fall of Voldemort was true. The end of the war was true mostly for a while. That last bit was harder to verify. The Ministry, lacking better information, would simply assert it. The Daily Prophet, lacking even less, would print it. The Wireless would sing it. A statue would, eventually, be commissioned. The Department of Mysteries, working from the actual readings, would not be entirely sure where the survivor had survived, and would close the file with the kind of deliberate vagueness departments of mysteries are paid for. Albus Dumbledore, who had received Hagrid by flu at 1:45 in the morning and listened to the story without interrupting, sat for a long while afterward in his office with one hand on his desk and the other hand against his chin. He was a man who had spent his life making plans, and he was a man who had also spent his life understanding that plans were stories told to oneself. He had a story told to himself in this room, and tonight a piece of it had walked out a door he did not see in his version of the cottage. He said to no one in particular, well, he looked at Fawkes. Fawkes looked back. Fawkes said nothing because Fawkes was a phoenix and had been a phoenix for a long time and knew when speech would not improve a moment. Find me, said Dumbledore at last, anyone who keeps the older bowls. He meant the scryers who had nothing to do with the Ministry. He meant the small handful of wizards and witches across Britain and the continent who still did the kind of working that asked questions of the world rather than telling it what to be. He would, over the next several days, send letters out, and most of those letters would come back blank, and a few of them would come back with one word in them, which was the same word, and the word was North. Dumbledore would file that. Dumbledore would not yet know what he had been told. There had been a plan, somewhere in the ordering of things, by which a tabby cat had sat all day on a garden wall in Surrey and watched a family of muggles. The cat had watched a man named Vernon Dursley leave for work and return from work. The cat had watched a woman named Petunia Dursley deliver a milk bottle to the front step and retrieve it again with a furtive glance at the houses on either side. The cat had watched a small child named Dudley get his cot put out for an airing on the lawn. The cat had moved her tail back and forth in irritation. The cat was, of course, Minerva McGonagall, who as a younger woman had decided that the best way to undertake any uncomfortable surveillance was on 4 legs. She had been on the wall a long time. She did not approve of the family. She had said as much to her companion when at last, in the small hours of the morning, he had arrived in the lane. Dumbledore, she had said, retaking her own shape with the irritated economy of a woman who had given a long day to a poor purpose. These are the worst sort of muggles. There is a child in that house who is allowed to scream his way into a small, purple, furious face I do not enjoy looking at. The mother is the boy's aunt. She has not spoken his mother's name aloud in this house in 15 years. She regards her sister's existence as a personal embarrassment. I am telling you this because I want it on the record. I will be very put out if you have brought him here. Albus Dumbledore had stood at the curb in robes of a midnight color and looked down the lane and considered the question. He had brought with him a putter-outer that took the streetlights into itself one by one and left the lane in a soft, useful dark. He had not yet learned what he had come to tell. Minerva, he had said, we may be spared that argument. Hagrid is late. Hagrid had not come. Hagrid would not come. He was sitting at that hour on the floor of an empty nursery in Godric's Hollow with his face in his hands. He would eventually struggle up to the road and find the motorcycle gone and walk a long way in the dark and arrive at Hogwarts before noon with the news that there was no boy to deliver. He would tell Dumbledore in a voice that had been shouted hoarse and then cried hoarse and was, by the telling, a thing that had been wrung out twice. But on Privet Drive in the hour before dawn, Dumbledore had only the absence of Hagrid and a tabby cat's wife-of-lot patience and the sense that a piece of his plan had walked off the chessboard while he was looking at another square. He is late, Minerva had said, or he is not coming. Yes, Albus, I see that. She had looked at him. She had a face well suited to looking at men who needed it. You are quite certain there was a child? Quite certain. Then where? He had not been able to answer her. He had stood in the dark lane in Surrey for a very long minute, with the putter-outer in his hand and the streetlights eaten and the muggle houses sleeping in their rows, and he had reached for the small inner sense by which he had always located James Potter's son, and he had found it not where he expected and not where he could bring it back from. He had felt, and this is, perhaps, the closest a man like Albus Dumbledore came in his life to fear, a great cold. A great cold very far away, with the boy somewhere in it. Minerva, he had said at last, I think we shall have to wait for word. From whom? From whoever has him. She had stared at him. He had walked back down the lane and put the streetlights back, one by one with the putter-outer, and the lane had returned to the soft electric ordinariness of a Surrey night, and Minerva had returned to 4 legs and stalked off into the hedge in a state of tail-flicking offense. Word would come in pieces. Word would come from a few of the older bowls, which would say only north. Word would come from a portrait in a hallway at Hogwarts which would mutter, in the small hours, of a hall of bone and a cold queen. Dumbledore would file all of this. He had been overruled before. He was, on the whole, a man who could revise. He revised. In the cottage at Godric's Hollow, by the time the morning was full, the bodies were gone, and a ministry seal was on the door. The lane had been hushed by Aurors, and the muggles in the village had been gently disinclined from remembering quite as much as they otherwise would. Pumpkins still sat on stoops with their candles burned down. The smoke from the chimney had stopped. The mobile of tin owls hung at a strange angle in a room where the cot was empty, and the cot was being photographed. Far above the world, in a hall that was not in any direction that could be pointed at from the office at Hogwarts, Hel of Helheim came home with a child in her arms. The hall was called Elgidnir. It had been hers for as long as she remembered being herself. The roof was low and broad. The beams were fitted bone of beasts that had been old when the world was young. The floors were stone, and the stone had been laid by hands that no longer existed. The torches were not torches. They were little held places where light gathered when light was needed. Frost ran along the joins between the stones in a constant, unmoving tide, like a second mortar. The dead in her hall stood up as she came in. They did not stand up in the way the living did, all at once and noisy. They stood up as their attention happened to her. Some of them did not stand up because they had never sat down. The dead in Hell's Hall had several postures. They were neither in misery nor in rapture. They were waiting. Waiting was what they had been promised. A shade who had been a stable hand in Jetland a long time ago came forward as quickly as a shade can. He had been a dependable man in life, and he was a dependable shade. My lady, he said, with the courtesy he had been buried with, thou hast brought. A ward of the hall, said Hel, evenly. He is mortal. He will need warmth in places and quiet in others, and the small bits of food the small ones are given. Find me a cradle that fits. My lady, there is no cradle in the hall. Then make one, said Hel. Bone of the white deer at the gate, quartz from the third river, by midnight. Yes, my lady. The shade went off at the speed shades go, which is the speed of a thought you have not finished. Hel walked the length of the hall with the child against her shoulder. She passed her chair, which was bone, and the table where her counters were laid out, and the alcove where she kept the long ledger of unkindled souls. She passed the brazier that had not been lit in 3 centuries, and which she now glanced at, briefly, to consider whether to light it. She did not light it, not tonight. She came to the inner room where the hall opened up into a smaller hall, which had once been a private receiving room, and was now, by decree of the Queen, a place no one was to enter without invitation. She took the child in. She set him down on a low couch of dark wool that she had not used in a long time. She looked at him. He had fallen asleep on the way. He was small and thin in places he ought not to be, and his hair was already trying to be a nuisance to anyone who would later attempt to comb it. The brand on his forehead was healing. The brand on his forehead would not stop being a brand. The thing in the brand was furious in the way a small caged animal was furious. Hel sat on the couch beside the child. She extended the half of her hand that was bone. She set that half hand against the child's cheek. He did not flinch. Be warm here, she said. Be safe here. Be him. She paused. She tried again. Be permitted to grow here into whatever it is thou wilt grow into. The hall will not be cruel to thee. The hall has not been cruel to a child in a long age. I have raised one before thee, and I will not pretend it was a happy thing, but I will tell thee that I learned. Thou wilt find me cold. I am cold. The cold will not unmake thee. The thing on thy brow will, if I let it. I will not let it. We will weather it slow. We will weather it long. She paused again. Thy name is Harry, she said, and tried it once more with the slight oddness of her tongue around the H. Harry. I shall call thee child until I have grown used to it. The hall will call thee what I call thee. Thou wilt not always be small a while, sleep. The child slept. He had been sleeping. Hell sat by him without moving, because she had the patience of a glacier and the time of an immortal, and she was not in a hurry to be anywhere. Outside, in the wider hall, a stable hand who had been dead since the Jeets had ridden ponies coordinated the carving of a bone cradle with 3 other shades, all of whom had once been good at small wooden things. They worked by the slow lighting of the held light. They worked carefully. They worked because they had been told to, and because the alternative was going back to staring at the stones, which they had been staring at for centuries. In Asgard, Loki packed a small bag. He did not need it. He took it because it pleased him to look as if he might be staying. In the polished marble corridors of Olympus, Persephone composed the first of what would be many letters. She composed it on a slab of pale stone with the tip of a pen made of yew. She wrote in the formal hand. She wrote, "To Hel of Helheim, greetings. The dead have their domains. We do not contest the queen of one underworld out of courtesy to the queen of any other. There is a child in thy keeping who does not, by ordinary accounting, lie in thy meadow. I write to ask that thou consider what is owed." She paused, she rephrased. She wrote, "He is not a war soul, he is not a frost soul. He is a child. Children belong by old reckoning to the green half of the year. I have opinions. My husband has more. Persephone of the spring and the winter both." She rolled the slab. She sealed it with a poppy that had been dried and redampened. She handed it to Hermes. Hermes said, "Oh, this will be good." Persephone said, "Hermes, ma'am, behave." "Yes, ma'am." He went. Down beneath the cottage, the lane in Godric's Hollow filled and emptied through the night. The ministry came. The oarers came. Reporters arrived with notebooks and inadequate explanations. The cottage was photographed. The bodies were removed with a care that had not yet become careless. Headlines were drafted. Songs were begun. A woman in Hogsmeade with no children of her own knitted a pair of yellow booties for a baby who would never wear them, because she had heard a story on the wireless that she did not believe and wanted to believe. By dawn, on the British Isles, every witch and wizard knew the name of Harry Potter. None of them knew where he was. In Elgidnir, by a couch in an inner hall, Hel of Helheim did not move. The newly made cradle was being carried in. The child slept. The brand on his forehead breathed. The hall was very quiet. The hall had been quiet for a long time. The hall tonight was quiet in a slightly different way, and the quiet was not unwelcome. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The frozen cradle, the bone cradle, was finished before the dawn that did not come. There was no dawn in Helheim. There were lightnings and there were dimmings, and the dead in the lower halls measured these by long old habit, but the country itself did not turn its face to a sun, and the great stones did not warm. The cradle, when it came in carried by 4 shades whose hands had remembered carving in life and rediscovered it in death, gave off the faint mineral cool of new bone. It had been polished. It had been rubbed with quartz dust. The lip of it had been rounded so a small wrist with a thread tied around it could not be cut. The base was set in a frame of pale ash that had been brought up from the sleds at the gate. The shades carried the cradle into the inner room, and they set it down by the couch, and they bowed, in the small way the long dead bow, and they retreated. Hel of Helheim looked at the cradle a long moment. Then she looked at the child on the couch. She lifted him with the half of her hand that was still flesh, supporting his head with the half that was bone, and she set him down in the cradle the way a librarian shelves a book that is to be kept apart from the others. The child did not wake. The child had been sleeping in fits since the first jolt of the curse. The brand on his forehead was a thin, bright line. The thing inside the brand had taken a posture against the cold of the hall, like a small caged animal turning its back on the bars. It had been screaming inside itself in a register no one was paying attention to. The cold had begun, very gently, to do its work. Hel stood by the cradle. The thread on the child's wrist had unspooled a little in the carrying. She rewound it without disturbing the small fingers and tucked the loose end under the cuff. She stepped back. She turned and walked out of the inner room, and she closed the door behind her, and the dead in the wider hall did not look at her in any way that could be remarked on, because they had been her household for centuries and knew the difference between her looking after and her wanting to be let be. She went to the brazier. She did not light it. She stood by it for a time. Then she went to her chair, which was bone, and she sat in it, and she put her hands flat on the arms of the chair, and she let the working of the country settle around her again. The ledgers were where she had left them. The slow tide of unkindled souls moved across the page. She was queen of a kindly hell. She had a hall to keep. She had a child to keep now in addition to the hall, and this was a new thing in a long succession of old things. The first visitor came before the next dimming. He came down the long corridor in his own face. He had thought about coming as something else and had several entertaining options drafted, but had decided in the end that the courtesy of the hall was a thing he ought to honor when he came to see his daughter. He wore a tunic the color of hammered tin and a cloak the color of rain on slate. His hair was the deep wet red it took when he was being earnest. His eyes were the green of moss in a churchyard. "Daughter," said Loki, at the threshold of the great hall. "Father," said Hel of Helheim from her chair. He came in. The dead in the hall noticed him without making it obvious. Loki had a way of being noticed without being seen, and the dead in this hall had been the household of Loki's daughter for a long time and had developed a private etiquette about it. He crossed the floor with the long-legged casual stride of a man who was at home in many halls and did not pretend that any of them were better than the others. He stopped in front of his daughter's chair. He looked at her face for a moment. "You took a child," he said. "I did, from the Green Island." "Yes." "From a working that came apart." "Yes, you will be receiving letters. I have already received one." He laughed. It was a small laugh, not a wide one. He had several laughs and he used them like a singer using registers. This one was quiet and pleased and had a small interior weight. "From the green half of the year I take it." "From the green half of the year," said Hel. "And from the receiver of many. He sends a bouquet, apparently." "He does," said Loki. "He always sends a bouquet. He thinks it is courteous. He is correct, but in a way that cannot be acknowledged without making him insufferable. Where is the child?" "The inner room." "May I see him?" "Thou mayest. Thou shalt also be quiet." "I can be quiet." "Thou canst be many things," said Hel. "Be that one." He went. She did not go with him. She stayed in her chair, and she watched the corridor he had walked down, and she listened, with the half of her hearing that did not bother with sound, for any indication that her father was about to do something she would have to forbid. She did not think he would. She thought he had come, in fact, mostly in good faith. He was, on the whole, in good faith with her. He had been a complicated father in many small ways and a present one in most of the ways that counted. Loki, in the inner room, stood over the bone cradle for a long time. He did not say anything. He did not touch the child. He stood and looked, with his hands clasped behind his back like a man at a museum, and his face went through several expressions in series, none of which were broad enough to be called expressions if you had been watching from across a room. He thought about the thread on the wrist. He thought about the rune-shaped brand on the forehead. He thought about the way the child's eyelashes made a small shadow on the cheek. He thought about a small boy he had known in a different country who had grown up to be a god and had died very young. Then he reached down, and he tucked the loose end of the thread back under the cuff, very gently, the way Hel had done. He looked at the brand on the forehead. He whistled very softly between his teeth, a little three-note phrase that did not have any particular working in it. He went back out to the great hall. "He has a horcrux on his head," Loki said conversationally to his daughter. "I noticed," said Hel. "The cold is at it. Yes, it will be gone in a few years. Yes, he may be quite difficult to kill by the time the cold is done with him. That is, in part, why I took him." Loki looked at her. He had several looks, and he used them like a singer using registers. This one was the look of a parent who has, despite his best efforts, been pleased with his child. "Thou wert bored," he said. "I was bored. And the green half wanted him, and the green half wanted him, and thou took him out from under their noses. I took him out from under their noses." "Daughter," said Loki, "I am going to enjoy this very much." "Father," said Hel, "thou wilt enjoy it modestly, because the green half is going to be very tedious about it for a long time, and I will not have my hall full of correspondence. I shall help thee with the correspondence. Thou wilt make it worse. Thou wilt see." She did. He helped her with the correspondence. He helped her with it in the way that he helped with most things, which was to say that he made it more elegant in places and more dangerous in others, and that the letters he drafted on her behalf to the Lord Hades had a particular slow quality of charity just shy of insult that she had not been able to manage on her own. The Lord Hades's responses came back, after some weeks, with a delicate edge that was nearly amused. The marriage of Hel of Helheim and the receiver of many was, on paper, a long correspondence about a child that neither of them properly had any claim to. It got better with practice. The second visitor came when the cradle was still new. She came down the corridor in robes of patient gray. Her hair was bound in 3 braids. She had not been to Helheim in a long time, although she had right to come and went where she went by right and not by invitation. Her face had an unusual stillness about it that the household of Hel had learned to read with a small respectful care. She carried a covered basket on one arm and her hands inside her sleeves on the other. "Sigyn," said Hel, rising from her chair. "Daughter of my husband," said Sigyn. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had spent a long time keeping bowls steady. "I bring honey cakes." Loki said there was a child. "There is," said Hel. he is not thine. He is mine by ward, he is not mine by blood. Even so, said Sigyn, honey cakes. She uncovered the basket. The basket held a dozen small honey cakes wrapped in clean cloth. They were not magical, they were not cursed. They were small honey cakes baked in the upper kitchen of Sigyn's hall by Sigyn herself, who in life had been a baker in addition to other things and had lost none of her hand for it in immortality. The cakes were warm. The cakes smelled of butter and honey. The dead in the hall, who did not eat any more but who remembered eating, drifted, very faintly, in the direction of the basket, with the distant patience of long-dead ants at a wedding. He is too small to eat them, said Hel. He will not always be too small, said Sigyn. Set them by, tell him when he is older that they were brought by his father's wife. Thou art kind. I am thorough, said Sigyn. Hand me the basket, I will set them in the cool place. She did not ask to see the child. She did not make remarks, she did not stay long. When she went, she touched the back of Hel's hand, briefly, with 2 fingers, and that was all the affection between them that the hall would witness in years. Sigyn was, on the whole, a woman who managed her affections by economy and who made them last by spending them slow. The third visitor came in disguise and was not let in. He had, Hermes admitted later, expected to be let in. He had assumed he would be let in. He was, after all, a god of messengers, and he had a sealed missive on a yew slab tucked into his belt, and he had brushed his hair, and he had a quip at his disposal that he had been polishing for the better part of a long afternoon. He had presented himself at the gate of Helheim in the formal hand of a herald. He had announced his name. He had announced his sender. He had announced his message. He had received, as a reply, the slow incline of the gatekeeper's helm. Thou art admitted to the antechamber, the gatekeeper had said. The queen does not receive in person, but I have a sealed. Thou wilt give the sealed missive to me, said the gatekeeper, who in life had been a man of great quiet and in death had become a man of even greater quiet, and thou wilt receive a sealed missive in return, and thou wilt depart by the road thou camest by. Thou art a god of messengers, thou knowest the protocol. I have a quip, said Hermes. I have heard quips before, said the gatekeeper. Many of them did not survive the antechamber. Hermes, on the whole, considered himself a connoisseur of small, unwelcome moments, and he conceded this one with the grace of a man who knew his trade. He handed over the slab. He waited. He was given in due course a sealed slab in return. The seal was a thin disk of pale frost. He took it. He bowed. He went. He went to Olympus by the long way because he wanted to think on the journey how he was going to phrase the report. The report he gave Persephone was, in the end, a model of restrained gossip. The gossip he gave the corner table at the tavern in Athens that did not technically exist was, in the end, considerably less restrained. The fourth visitor was, technically, not a visitor. He was a witness. He had been a witness for a long time. He stood at his post at the bridge that did not always look like a bridge, and he had watched everything since the cottage. He had watched Loki come down the corridor. He had watched Sigyn come down the corridor. He had watched Hermes turn back at the gate. He had watched the cradle being carried in. He had watched the brand on the small forehead breathe in and out in the inner room. He had watched with the particular professional attention of a man who watched as a job, and he had not raised his horn, because the matter, on consideration, did not constitute a thing worth raising the horn for. He did make one small note in the long ledger he kept in the back of his mind of matters that might one day require attention. He made the note in a hand smaller than the rest. He filed the note. He went back to watching. His name was Heimdall. He had a face like a long sea cliff. He spoke seldom. He did not smile. By the time the cradle had been in the inner room for a moon's worth of dimmings, the brand on the small forehead had begun, very faintly, to dull at the edges. This was not, by ordinary accounting, supposed to happen. A horcrux is a thing that holds its working with the stubbornness of a man who has staked a lot on a single bet. The piece of soul inside it does not dim. It does not dull. It does not, in particular, get washed at the edges by the slow weather of an underworld. But the underworld of Helheim is a kindly hell, and a kindly hell has its own weather, and the weather is patient, and it is steady, and it does not make an exception for foreign workings made in distress. The brand dulled. The thing inside it, which had been inhabited by a sliver of a man who had been very angry indeed at the world, found that the cold of the hall did not seem to be hostile to it. It was not hostile in the way the cottage had been hostile in the moment of the rebound. It was not hostile in the way the dimensional way had been hostile in the long descent. It was simply cold. It was cold the way a slow river is wet. The sliver, which had been screaming inside itself, found that the cold simply listened. It was not an enemy. It was not a friend. It was the air. It would, the sliver realized after some weeks, be the heir for a long time. The sliver made an attempt at the child. It tried to put a thought in the child's head. The thought was a small, fierce thought about wanting a thing the sliver could not name. The thought arrived in the child. The child made a small, unhappy noise in the cradle. Hel, who was at her chair, looked up. She set down her ledger. She walked into the inner room. She sat by the cradle. She put the half of her hand that was still flesh on the child's chest. "Hush," she said. "Thou hast a guest. Thou art not obliged to host him." She held the half hand there. She worked very slowly, with the calm of a woman working a knot on the place where the sliver's thought had attached itself. She did not pull. She simply worked. After some time, the sliver let go. The thought went away. The child slept again. The sliver, which had not been spoken to by the Queen of Helheim before, found, to its dismay, that it had developed a respect for the Queen of Helheim. It did not want to have developed this respect. It wanted to be a clean, angry, small thing on a small forehead. The respect was a complication. The sliver, sulking, withdrew. It did not leave. It could not leave. It was bound. But it stopped trying for a while to put thoughts in the child's head. This was the first lesson the small Horcrux had to learn. It learned slowly. It would, over the next 9 years, learn several more. The fifth visitor came in a dimming that was deeper than most. A digression on the household of Eldjidnir, since the household of Eldjidnir is, in this story, going to be doing the slow work of raising a child, and it is best to know what raising a child looks like in such a household. The hall had, by long count, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 permanent residents. Permanent was a word that meant only that they were not in a hurry to go elsewhere. The dead in Hell's Hall were not bound to it the way the dead in some other halls were bound. They had come because they had been assigned, by quiet old workings, to a place that was for the unkindled, by which was meant the dead who had not died in great deeds and had not died in great failings, but who had simply died, the way most of the dead die, of inconvenient things in middling lives. They were promised waiting. They had received it. They were content, on the whole, to keep on receiving it. They had worked out small accommodations among themselves over centuries, the way a long boarding house works out the small accommodations of who uses the kettle and who feeds the cat, except that there was no kettle and the cat was metaphorical, and the centuries did not pass in any way that strained patience. There were soldiers among them, although they were not the war dead and would have been quick to say so. They were old men who had served some time in some company in some country, and had then come home and farmed and died of nothing in particular. There were craftsmen. There were 3 blacksmiths, 2 coopers, a sailmaker who had not made a sail in 800 years and was afraid she had forgotten how, a stonecutter who came out only at certain dimmings, 4 bakers, an embroiderer, a glassblower without a glass, a man who had been a clerk for a cathedral that had since fallen down and remained, in death, vaguely embarrassed by his profession. There were mothers and there were grandmothers, and there were 3 great-grandmothers who had, in life, mended every sock in their parishes, and who took, in death, a slow proprietary interest in any sock that came past them. There were children, not many. Children, on the whole, did not go to Helheim. Children, on the whole, when they died, were given a small, clean place of their own and were tended there by a different working with a different staff. But there were a few. There were children who had not had families to be tended in. There were children who had asked, when they died, to come where their grandfather had gone, and the grandfather had been here, and so they had come. There were 8 of them, at the time the new ward was set in the bone cradle. 6 girls and 2 boys. The oldest of them looked, in shade, about 10. The youngest of them looked, in shade, about 5. They had been 10 and 5 for a very long time. Hel of Helheim had not, before the new ward, paid them particular attention. They had been, in her ledgers, a small cluster of small entries, and they had been content, and they had been quiet, and they had not asked her for anything. The new ward changed this in small ways. The 8 children, after a time, began to drift in their slow shade drift toward the door of the inner room. They did not enter. They had not been invited. They drifted near the door, and they sat in the wider hall on the floor, and they looked at the door, and they did not say anything to each other. Hel noticed this, at her chair, on the 3rd dimming. She did not, by long habit, address the children of her hall directly. She had not had to. She did so now. "Thou 8, she said. The 8 children looked up. "Thou wishest to see the small thing?" The eldest of them, a girl in shade gray with a long straight braid, said, "If it would not displease thee, my lady." "It would not displease me. He is asleep. He is not today a thing to be played with. He is a thing to be looked at. Thou wilt look at him quietly. Thou wilt go in 8 at a time, since thou art 8, and thou wilt come out as soon as I say. Stand near the door." They stood near the door. They went in 8 at a time. They looked at the small mortal in the bone cradle. They did not touch the cradle. They did not speak. They looked at him with the long, careful patience of long-dead children who had learned not to make wishes out loud. They came out. They went back to the wider hall. They sat on the floor again. They looked at each other. After a while, the eldest of them, the girl in the long braid, said, "He's warm." "He's warm," said one of the boys. "He smells of milk," said another of the girls. "He has a thread," said the smallest girl, who was younger in shade than she had been in life, and was, accordingly, a little freer with her remarks. The eldest girl looked at Hel. Hel looked at her. The eldest girl said, in the careful formal tongue she had learned to use for the queen, "My lady, are we permitted when he is older to play with him?" Hel of Helheim considered. She did not, by old habit, encourage the children of her hall to attach themselves to the living. The living, in due course, ceased to be living, and the attachment became a long, delicate matter that the queen had to manage, and the queen on the whole had things she would rather manage. But the new ward was not, by any of the long-fixed accountings, a usual living. He was, in a manner not yet declared but not yet ruled out, going to grow up in this hall. He was going to need playmates. The hall had 8 playmates, free of immediate occupation, who had spent a long time being patient and would not, on the evidence, mishandle him. "When he is older," said Hel, "when he can walk, not before." "Yes, my lady," said the eldest girl. "Thou shalt not teach him to be afraid." "No, my lady." "Thou shalt not teach him to be cruel." "No, my lady." "Thou shalt teach him, instead, the games of thy time. There are games thou hast not played in centuries that he will not know, and thou wilt teach them to him in turn, and he will learn them, and thou wilt have small reasons to come out from thy corners. The hall will be the better for it." The eldest girl made a small bow with the particular grace dead children sometimes had. The 8 of them got up, and they went, with the slow shade drift, back to the corner of the hall they had come from. They did not, on the whole, look any different from how they had looked. They had, on the whole, become a small fraction more inhabited. Hel went back to her chair. She picked up the ledger. She looked at the column where the small ward's entry had begun. She added a small note in the margin, in her own hand, which read, "He will be raised among them." This was the second lesson the small ward learned, although he was too young to know he was learning it, and he had not yet opened his eyes long enough to see the eldest girl in the long braid who would, 8 years later, teach him a hand-clapping game that was 1100 years old and had not been clapped in 800. The lesson was, the hall is to be shared. The lesson sank in slowly, in the way lessons sink in for children who are not being lectured at, and it did not need to be repeated. The small ward also did not yet know, although he would, in his own time, that the bone cradle had been carved by hands that had carved cradles before, and that the 4 shades who had carved it had, every one of them, been parents in life, and had been, in some private slow way, very glad to carve a cradle again. He did not know that the small honey-cakes Sigyn had brought were sitting in a covered tin on a high shelf in the upper kitchen, and that the cook who minded the upper kitchen, who in life had been a housekeeper for a night in the 8th century, was waiting for the day the ward was old enough to chew honey-cakes. He did not know that the sailmaker who had not made a sail in 800 years had quietly begun making, of an old pale silk that the queen had given her, a small sail-shaped thing the size of a child's palm, and that the small sail-shaped thing was going to turn out, in the fullness of time, to be the first kite the small ward ever flew. He did not know any of this. He did not need to know any of this. The hall was slowly, in its own slow way, doing the work the hall had not been called on to do in centuries, and the hall was finding, on the whole, that it remembered the work. She came in robes of green that had no business being green in that country, and yet were green, and she did not need to come, and yet she came. The gatekeeper let her in without protocol, because Persephone of the spring and the winter both was a queen by her own right and an underworld matter besides, and the gatekeeper recognized a sister domain when one walked up to him with her hands folded and her hair in the long single plait that meant a formal visit. She was met in the antechamber by Hel of Helheim. The antechamber was a small clean room with a long bench of dark wood and a brazier that was, on this occasion, lit. Hel had had it lit, in fact, because she had received word some hours before that Persephone was coming. Hel did not light braziers for small occasions. She had lit this one, and she had set out 2 cups of something warm that was not tea but resembled tea in the dark, and she had put on the robes that did not have ash on them. Persephone took her place on the bench. She accepted the cup. She did not drink yet. She set the cup on her knee and looked at her sister queen for a long moment, and the look was not a friendly one exactly, but it was not unfriendly either, and it had the considered weight of a queen who had decided to spend goodwill in a place where she did not think she would get it back at par. "Daughter of Loki," said Persephone, "thou hast a child." "I have a ward," said Hel, by formula, spoken on the threshold, in the cot, Persephone closed her eyes briefly. The closing of the eyes was the closing of an avenue of argument she had been considering. Then he is thine by the form. He is mine by the form. My husband sends his protest. I have read it. He sends also a small token. A bouquet. A bouquet. The second one this week. The second one of many, said Persephone. He will send a bouquet for as long as it takes thee to take the matter seriously. He has a long supply of bouquets. I have a long supply of vases. Persephone's mouth made a small movement that on another face would have been a smile. Sister, she said, I have come to ask thee a thing. Ask. He will be raised. He will be raised. He will be raised among the dead. The kindly dead, the dead who are not in punishment, the dead who have been promised waiting and have received it. Even so, children are not waiting things. He will not wait. He will grow. Hel, Persephone, I would prefer if thou didst not raise him cold. Hel of Helheim looked at the queen of the spring across the dark cup of warm knot tea. The half of her face that had skin looked very tired. The half that had bone did not have a movement to make. I am cold, said Hel. He will know cold from me. I cannot pretend the hall is otherwise. I will not lie to a child in his cradle. He will know cold. He will know also that the cold has not unmade him. There are things one learns from the cold that one cannot learn from the green. There are things one learns from the green that one cannot learn from the cold. He will be raised on the cold half. He is older if thou wilt have him. He may visit the green. That is acceptable. I had not asked for thy acceptance. Even so, it is acceptable. Persephone drank finally. The warm knot tea was bitter and dark and had a small shadow at the back of it that was almost a sweetness. She held it on her tongue. She let it go. Thy father came, she said. He did. He approves. He is amused. That is in his mouth the same thing. Yes, and the receiver of many disapproves. He does. And his disapproval will be in his mouth the same thing as approval. Thou knowest this. I do. Then we are at the place we were going to come to. We are. Then I will leave thee with 2 requests and 1 gift. I will hear them. The first request I will visit, not often, once a year in the seasons of my underworld. I will bring small gifts and large news. I will not interfere with thy raising of him. I will in my own time bring him to my hall when he is old enough to come. Granted. The second request, thou wilt write me a letter at every solstice. Thou wilt tell me how he grows. Hel considered this. It was a request that did not feel like it ought to bother her, and yet it did, in a small way. It was the request of a sister queen with no children of her own to a sister queen who had taken a child with no claim. It was a request that Hel could refuse by the protocols and not lose face. Hel did not refuse it. She thought of why she did not, and she found after a moment that she had no particular reason to refuse and that Persephone had asked in the right way. Granted, she said. Then the gift, said Persephone. She reached into her sleeve. She brought out, between 2 fingers, a single living violet. It was a deep purple at the edges and a paler purple at the throat. It had not stopped being living in this country, and would not stop being living. It would not, in fact, ever wilt, although it would change a little over years. It was a small flower in the palm of a queen. For him, said Persephone, when he is old enough to be told what it is. Until then, set it where he can see it. Tell him a sister queen sent him a thing that does not die. He will, when he is old enough to think about it, want to know why. Hel of Helheim looked at the violet. She did not for a long moment take it. It is a working, she said. It is a kindness. It is a working. It is both. Hel reached out and she took the violet, and she did not say thank you, because the queens did not say thank you to each other, but she nodded, and the nod was the same thing, and Persephone returned it, and the visit was concluded. When Persephone was gone, Hel went into the inner room with the violet. She set it in a small copper box that had not been used in a long time. The box had a lid that did not quite close. She left the lid not quite closed. She put the box on a shelf at the height of the cradle, where when the child was old enough to sit up and look around, he would see it, and he would, eventually, ask. The brand on his forehead, very slightly, dulled a little more. In Olympus, much later that evening, Persephone wrote a letter to her husband. She wrote, he will be raised cold. The queen has agreed to a yearly visit. He may yet come to us in time. We are not, on the whole, well placed to demand more. Hades wrote back, send the bouquet anyway. Odin far north received a smaller missive at his seat. He read it. He set it aside. It is a kindly Hel, he said, to no one in particular. She will raise him kindly enough. I do not approve. I do not interfere. The world went on turning. In Helheim, at the inner room, the child slept. In a corner of the great hall, Loki sat on a low stool with a piece of cord in his hands, and he tied a knot. He untied it. He tied a more interesting knot. He untied that too. He looked at the cord, and he looked at the door of the inner room, and he made a small considering sound. Daughter, he said after a while. Father, said Hel from her chair. I shall come often. I had assumed. I shall not bring chaos. Thou shalt bring small chaos. Small chaos. Small chaos is acceptable. I had hoped. He tied the cord into a shape that suggested a small bird. He looked at it. He set it on the floor beside the stool. The shape did not move. The shape did not have any working in it. It was, on the whole, a knot in a cord made by a god who had decided to make small things while he sat in his daughter's hall. He will need a teacher, said Loki after a longer while. Several teachers. The hall has many teachers in residence, by virtue of being the hall it is. He will need lessons in the small workings when his hands are old enough. He will, and thou wilt be one of those teachers. I had hoped. Thou wilt also not teach him to do anything I will have to explain to thy wife. Thou knowest me, daughter. That is exactly why I say it. Granted, said Loki. The child in the cradle in the inner room made a small sound. It was not an unhappy sound. It was the sound a child makes when a dream has touched him with one finger and gone away again. The thread on his wrist had loosened. The brand on his forehead had dulled, very slightly, at one edge. The kindly weather of the kindly hell continued to do its work without comment. Far away in the green half of the world, a man with no body was floating in the wind through a forest in Albania. He was thin. He was so thin that he was almost not there. He was furious in a way that a body could not have contained, which was, on consideration, the only reason he had managed to stay coherent at all. He was, however, smaller than he had been before the cottage. He was, although he did not know this yet, considerably smaller than he had been before the cottage. He was missing a piece of himself that he believed had gone to the boy. He intended to get it back. He intended, while he was at it, to get the boy back as well, and to undo him in a leisurely fashion. He had a great deal of leisure ahead of him. He thought of the leisure with what passed, in a wraith of his condition, for satisfaction. He did not yet know that the piece he was thinking about was, by then, quite a long way away from him, in a country whose air he could not enter, sitting on a small forehead in a small bone cradle in an inner room of a hall called Elgidnir, being slowly and methodically washed by a weather it had not known existed. He did not know, in particular, that the piece had developed a respect for the queen of that hall. The piece had told him, in their long binding, exactly nothing about its developing respect. The piece had reasons, on the whole, for keeping its mouth shut. He floated on. He did not know. He was confident in his ignorance. This was, by now, his preferred state. In Helheim, the brazier in the antechamber went out. It had been lit for a visit. It would not be lit again until another visit was scheduled. The hall went on. Hel of Helheim had a household to run. She ran it. She had a long ledger to keep. She kept it. She had now a child to raise. She raised him. The child was small, and he was warm, and he did not cry, and he did not fuss, and he slept long and ate little and looked, when he looked, at the world with the steady gaze of a child who had been brought up so far very gently and had found nothing yet to flinch from. The half of her face that was still flesh, when she stood over the cradle in the inner room at the Dimmings, sometimes, very slightly, made a movement that was not quite a smile and was not quite not. The bone cradle was cool to the touch. The bone cradle did not warm. The child in the bone cradle did not catch a chill. The cold of the hall, which was patient and steady, and did not make an exception for foreign workings, also did not make an exception for the small foreign mortal who slept inside it. The cold did not unmake him. The cold did not freeze him. The cold simply held him in the long, clean way the hall held everything it kept. The brand on his forehead breathed in and out very slightly, and the thing inside the brand learned slowly that there was in this country no enemy to fight, and therefore that the fighting it had been built to do was in this country not a thing it could do, and therefore that it ought perhaps to consider doing something else. And the something else after some weeks became a quiet, and the quiet after some months became a gentling, and the gentling after some years became a thinning, and the thinning, after several more years, would become something that could not, by any honest accounting, be called a horcrux any more. That was a long way off, but it had begun. It had begun in a bone cradle in an inner room in a hall called Elgidnir, on a small forehead with a thin bright line on it, while a queen with half a face stood over the cradle, and a god of mischief sat on a stool in the wider hall and tied small bird shapes out of cord, and a clerk in a basalt hall under a country far to the south opened a longer file and started a new column. The kindly hell kept the child. The child slept. The hall went on. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. A childhood of unkindled things he walked at 14 months. Hell had not been timing him, but it was the eldest of the dead children who came running into the great hall, in her shade drift run that was not a run at all and did not raise her braid, to report that the small one had stood up by the side of the cradle, and put one foot in front of the other and put it down and put the other foot in front of that one and walked 4 paces and sat down hard. The eldest girl, whose name in life had been Astrid, had clapped her hands twice. The smallest of the children, whose name in life had been Wisp, had clapped 4 times because she had not been counting. The small one had looked at them with the considering steady look of a child who has decided that having achieved a thing he is now entitled to be looked at, and had not cried. Hel had gone in and watched him do it again. She had stood with her hands behind her back. He had walked 5 paces this time. She had nodded. She had said, "Set out a small tunic for him," to the cook, and the cook, who was used to taking her instructions at one remove, had set out a small tunic, and the children had, the next dimming, helped him into it. He spoke at 20 months. His first word was not the word she had expected. She had expected somehow, not because she had been hoping for it, but because the parts of her that watched mortals in their first words were a long time out of practice, that he would say something like "ma." He did not. His first word was the word for thread. He had been holding the loose end of his cuff between 2 fingers, and he had said very precisely, "thread," with the slight weight on the th that the cook used. She had not bothered to correct him. She had not bothered, as a rule, to talk to him in Queen's speech. She had talked to him in the speech of her household, which was the long old tongue. He had picked up that tongue and the tongues the children spoke, and a fragment of mortal English from somewhere none of them quite knew, and the small soft tongue Sigyn had used the once, and he was, on the whole, a child in a house with several languages who had been told to choose what he liked. He chose thread first. He chose, after that, the names of the 8 children and the cook and several of the ledgers. He said the Queen's name on his 2nd month of talking. He said it as MMA because the H was hard. She did not, on that occasion, have any expression that could be remarked on, but she did get up from her chair and walk over and pick him up, and he had laughed, the small, uncomplicated laugh of a child who has been picked up by the person he had been hoping would pick him up, and the half of her face that was bone had, by some trick of the held light, looked for a moment less like bone. By 3 he could read. He could read because the children had taught him. They had been bored a long time, and they had between them recovered, from the corners of the hall and the shelves and the alcove of the unkindled ledgers, a small collection of books and slates and cards and woodcuts that no one had been keeping track of. They had set him on the floor with a slate and a piece of soft chalk, and Astrid had taught him the shapes of the runes, and a boy named Ro had taught him the letters of an old island tongue that no one alive on the surface still spoke, and Wisp had taught him counting, because Wisp had counted clapping. He had, on the whole, learned a number of small things at once, and learned them well enough that the teaching had needed only to be done once. By 4, he could play chess. He had been taught to play chess by a man who had been a centurion in the 8th Roman Legion. His name had been Marcus. He had died in his sleep at the age of 52 of nothing in particular, and had been sent to Helheim, because nothing in particular had not been a heroic enough death to send him anywhere else. And he had not, on the whole, minded. He had had a good life, and had not begrudged the kindly hell its kindly accommodations. He had been a chess teacher in life, in the years before he died, when he had retired and had taken on small boys for small fees in a small town in northern Gaul. He had not had any boys to teach in a long time. He had, when the Queen mentioned a small boy in need of teachers, set out his board, which was made of dark and pale stone and was older than several of the other shades, and he had been ready inside the hour. The small boy, whose name was Harry, by then 4 years old and a head shorter than most of the children he played with, had sat across from Marcus at the small board, and had received the first lesson with the careful attention he gave to most things. Marcus had taught him pieces, then movement, then captures, then the principle that you do not move a piece into harm without a reason. Harry had taken to all of these. He had, on the whole, a slow, steady mind for a 4-year-old, and he had not been distracted by any of the things 4-year-olds are distracted by, because there were not in the hall many such things to be distracted by. He played with Marcus 3 dimmings a week. He won his first game at 5. Marcus had not, on that occasion, let him win, and Harry had known it. By 5 he could throw a knot. This was Loki's lesson, and it was the only one of the lessons that Hel had said in advance, "Be careful." Loki had taken the warning, and had made a face about it that was not a serious face, and had then, in fact, been careful. He had taught Harry the small workings that traveled through cord. He had shown him the 7 knots that did not have any working in them but had to be learned in order. He had shown him the 8 knots that had small workings in them, that were the small workings of luck and direction finding and undoing and finding again. He had shown him, at the end of a long winter, the 1 knot that, properly tied, drew the eye of a thing that had been hiding from you. Harry had learned the knots. He had also learned, from Loki, the slower lesson of when not to tie them. "Thou wilt not always tie them only because thou canst," said Loki to him on a low stool in the great hall with the cord between them on the floor. Thou wilt tie them when thou hast a reason. Thou wilt not have the reason often. Most of the days thou wilt simply hold the cord and do nothing. The cord will know that thou couldst. It will be sufficient. Yes, uncle, said Harry, who had decided, without asking anyone, to call Loki uncle, and had not been corrected. Thou wilt also not tie them in the presence of those who do not know thou hast learned them. Yes, uncle. Thou wilt also not tie them in the presence of thy mother, unless she has asked thee to. Yes, uncle. Thou art quick. I have 8 teachers, uncle. They are not patient. Thou least child, Astrid is patient, Wisp is patient, Marcus is patient, the cook is patient. The cook is not patient, the cook is exact. Loki had looked at him a long moment, then he had laughed his small interior laugh. Thou art Hel's child, he said. She has done the work, be it noted. I am in awe. Thou art often in awe, uncle. It does not mean as much when thou art in awe as when others are. Thou art Hel's child, said Loki again, and tied a knot in the cord with one hand without looking and undid it. Thou art my granddaughter's grandson by the long form, and that I will tell thee on my proudest dimmings. Now untie this. Harry untied it. Harry's hands were small and his fingers were not yet long, but they were quick, and they had been doing this for a year. He undid the knot in the time of 3 breaths. He held the cord up. Quicker than last week, said Loki. Slower than next week. Tie me, child, the small undoing knot. That is the knot of the breaking of an oath. It is. We do not tie it without reason. I have a reason. I wish to see thee tie it. Yes, uncle. He tied it. He had to look at his fingers because the small undoing knot was not yet automatic. He tied it slow, but he tied it correctly. Loki examined it. Loki nodded once. Now, said Loki, untie it without breaking it. Harry looked up. That is not a thing, he said. Thou hast taught me that the small undoing knot can only be undone by being broken. The breaking is the working. I have lied, said Loki. I have lied about many small things. I lied about that. There is a way of untying the small undoing knot without breaking it. I will not show thee the way. Thou wilt find it. When, in thy own time, thou hast time, I shall not see thee for several dimmings. Find the way before I see thee again, or find it any time after, or never find it, as thou wilt. Lessons of mine are not graded. Yes, uncle. Harry found the way in 3 dimmings. He sat in the inner room with the cord, and the knot in his lap, and the small 4-headed brand breathing in and out very faintly above his eyes. And he turned the knot in his hands a long time, and he did not, on the whole, panic about it. And after the first dimming he had observed that the knot, while sealed, had a small opening at the back. And after the second dimming he had observed that the small opening at the back, while sealed by being tucked against the tail end of the cord, was not sealed by working but by simple geometry. And after the third dimming he had teased the tail end out with the tip of his pinky, very slow, and the knot had come apart in his lap, intact and untied. He had looked at the knot, he had set it down. He had said to no one in the room the small word for finding something that had been hidden in the long old tongue. He had felt in his own way satisfied, not pleased exactly, but satisfied, the satisfaction of a thing done at the slow pace it had to be done at. When Loki came again, Harry had the cord in his hand. Loki had looked at him. Harry had handed him the cord. Loki had looked at the cord, which was untied. Loki had not in any of the wider gestures expressed a thing. 3 dimmings, said Loki. 3. Faster than I, thou wert 8. I was 6. Thou hast lied to me twice this season, uncle. I have. I shall continue to. Be alert. Yes, uncle. Loki had gone to his daughter at the chair, and he had said low, daughter, he is a piece of work. He is. He is thine and not thine. He is mine, by formula. He is also his mother's, by blood, and his father's, by blood in the cradles, by carving in the cook's, by feeding in the children's, by playing in Marcus's, by chess, and mine, by formula, and thine, by not. He is a piece of work, as thou sayest. He is the strangest child I have ever seen, said Loki, with the small shadow of a thing that was not quite paternal and was not quite not. I am proud to have a hand in him. Be alert, said Hel. I shall, the hall went on. By 6 he could throw his voice. This was, again, Loki's lesson, and it had taken a longer time than the knots. The throwing of a voice in the long old craft was not the parlor trick of the modern ventriloquist. It was the slow, careful working by which a man's words could appear to come from a place where the man was not, and could, if one had practiced, do so without accent and without disturbing the air. Harry had, after a year, mastered the basics. He could put his voice in the corner of the great hall, where it would arrive at the ears of any shade in the corner, without the shades looking up. He could put his voice in a stone in the floor, where it would emerge as a low murmur. He could not yet put his voice in another mouth, because that was a higher level of the craft, and Loki had made it clear that the higher level was not for children. Thou wilt practice, said Loki, the level thou art at, and thou wilt not reach for the next. The reach for the next, before the level thou art at is mastered, is what makes a man a fool. I have been a fool many times. I do not, on the whole, recommend it as a state. Yes, uncle. By 7 he could walk past a wraith without flinching. This was hell's lesson, and it was the longest of the lessons, and it was not, in the end, taught in any one teaching, but in the gradual accumulation of a great many small accommodations. The wraiths in Helheim were not the kindly dead. The wraiths in Helheim were a small and separate population, kept in a separate quarter of the lower hall, who were the dead who had not, in life, settled their small persistent quarrels, and who continued to carry the small persistent quarrels on into death, and they would, over centuries, soften, and set down their grievances one by one, and become, at last, kindly dead like the rest, and move into the upper hall, but the softening was slow. And in the meantime, the wraiths drifted in their quarter with a low murmur of grievance, and they could be felt in the hall by anyone who came near their quarter, and the feeling, on the whole, was unpleasant. Hel had taken Harry to the lower quarter on his 6th birthday, which was the birthday at which, in her judgment, he was old enough to see what the hall's slow charity looked like at its hardest. She had taken him by the half hand that was bone. She had walked him past the wraiths slowly. She had not let him stop. She had not let him stare. She had told him, in low voice, who each of the wraiths had been and what each of them had not yet set down. She had pointed out by name an old woman who had been, in life, in a feud with her sister over a strip of land, and who had brought the feud into death without the sister, who had gone to a different hall, and was therefore feuding alone, with no opponent, and would, in time, come to the embarrassing realization that there was no one to feud with, and would set the feud down. She had pointed out by name an old man who had been, in life, owed money by a man who had not paid him, and who carried the unpaid debt in his shade like a weight on a yoke, and would, in time, set the debt down too. She had pointed out by name 3 wraiths who were, on the count of the queen, close to softening, and 3 wraiths who were, on the count of the queen, far from softening, and she had told Harry that the close ones and the far ones were not, in the long count, different, only at different points on the same long curve, and that the hall would, in its own time, attend to all of them. Harry had walked past them. He had not flinched. He had felt at the end of the long walk slightly cold, not the cold of the hall, which by then was the air he breathed and did not register, but a different cold, which was the cold of having met a number of small persistent griefs and not been able, by virtue of being a small mortal child, to do anything about them. He had asked at the gate of the lower quarter, "Are they unhappy, mother?" "They are not in misery," said Hel. "They are not in rapture. They are at the small persistent unease they made for themselves in life. They will, in time, set it down. Some of them have been here for 2 centuries, some for 10. The hall does not hurry them. The hall is patient. Thou wilt also be patient with them. If thou seest one in passing, thou wilt not address her. Thou wilt nod to her courteously. Thou wilt walk on. They are not for thee, they are for me. Yes, mother, I have brought thee here once. I shall not bring thee here again unless thou askest. If thou askest, I shall. Yes, mother." She had taken him out. She had walked him back to the upper hall. She had set him in the wide chair beside her own, which was small enough that his feet did not touch the floor, and she had given him a cup of warm knot tea, and she had let him sit with his cup for a long time while she returned to the ledgers. He had not, on that dimming, said anything more. He had drunk the cup slow. He had set it down. He had gone eventually to find Astrid, and had played for an hour the 1100-year-old hand-clapping game, and the sound of the hand-clapping in the great hall on that dimming had been remarked on by several of the dead as a small good thing. By 8 he had asked his question. The question had been some time coming. He had not, in any of the dimmings prior, asked the queen who his mortal mother had been, or his mortal father. He had been told, at intervals over the years, the small facts of his arrival. He had known, since he had been old enough to understand the words, that he had come to the hall as a small bundle in the cradle, and that he had not been born in this country, and that the queen had not given him birth but had taken him as ward, and that the brand on his forehead was a thing left over from the country he had come from. He had not asked for more. He had been a steady child in this regard. He had not been incurious, but he had, on the whole, picked up the cues that the hall was a place where one did not press, and that the queen, while she would answer if asked, did not invite asking, and that there was, in any case, a great deal to be getting on with in the meantime. On a long dimming in his 8th year, sitting on the floor by the queen's chair with a slate in his lap on which he had been working out a chess problem of Marcus's, he set the slate down, and he looked up at the queen, and he said, "Mother, what was my mortal mother's name?" Hel of Helheim set down the ledger she had been keeping. "Lily," she said. "She was called Lily Potter." "Lily. Yes. What did she look like?" "I did not know her. I saw her once. She was tall. She had hair the color of a fox's coat. She had eyes the color of the green you have been told the spring half is famous for. Persephone says she had a careful mouth and a careful mind for figures and a temper she did not always govern. She was 21 years old when she died. She had been a witch. She was a working woman, as the country she came from counts working women. Did she love me? Yes. She loved thee in the way of mortal mothers, which is the way that does not survive being lost. She died standing between thee and the man who killed her. She did not move. She was offered her life if she would step aside. She did not step aside. The working she did in the moment of dying is the working that has kept thee alive. Thou owest her thy bone. Thou wilt remember her in such a way as is right for a child raised in the country she did not bring thee to. He thought about this. He had been a slow, steady child for a long time. He thought about it slow. And my father, James Potter, he was tall. He had hair the color of dark wood. He had glasses on his face because his eyes did not see all things at once. He was a working man. He was a young man in love with several things, including thy mother, including thee, including a number of small particular foolishnesses. He died before thy mother. He died in the front room of the cottage where thou wert taken. I saw him after. He saw me. He looked at me with thee in my arms and he said, "Take care of him." I said I would. Thou hast. I have done what I said. I have not done it as he would have done it. I have done it as it could be done in the country we are in. Yes, mother. Hast thou other questions, child? 1. Ask, was thy taking me a kindness or a thing thou didst because thou wert bored? The Queen of Helheim looked at her ward a long moment. The half of her face that was flesh did not, in the dim light of the held light, change in any way that could be remarked on. The half of her face that was bone did not have a way to change, but there was a small movement of the throat, the small movement that is the swallowing of an old true answer. Both, she said, I will not lie to thee. I had been bored. I would not have taken thee on the boredom alone, but I would not have taken thee on the kindness alone either. They came together. The kindness has in the years since grown the larger. The boredom has gone on the whole to other halls. That is a true answer. It is. I am glad of both. I do not wish to have been taken by a queen who would have taken me on a kindness without a reason. The boredom is the reason. The kindness is what made the reason worth acting on. She looked at him. She did not in that moment have anything in her face to read. He looked back. The small bone-edged hand lifted, and she set it on the side of his head, the way she had done once when he was small in the cradle. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. The slate slid off his lap and clattered gently on the floor. The chess problem on it was the White Knight's fork, which he was, by then, working out for the third time and for which he had nearly the solution. He picked it up. He went back to it. The queen returned to her ledger. The hall went on. By 9 he had met Hades. The receiver of many had not, in the 8 years since he had filed the first formal protest, come to Helheim in person. He had filed protests. He had sent bouquets. He had drafted, with his wife, a number of formal documents in the elaborate, cold-warm tongue that Olympus and Helheim used between themselves. And he had received, with patience, the formal documents Hel of Helheim had sent in return. And the documents had, on the whole, become more cordial over the years. And the bouquets had begun to be drier flowers. And the protests had begun to acquire a certain dry humor in the closing paragraphs that suggested that the receiver of many was, on the whole, no longer expecting to win the case, but was enjoying the long, slow argument. He came in person on Harry's 9th birthday. He came down the long corridor in robes the color of old wine on slate. His face was the face of a man who had spent a great deal of time reading documents and a smaller amount of time being remarked on, and who had developed, accordingly, a face that did not invite remark. He came alone. Persephone was at her green half. He walked down the corridor with the slow, patient stride of a man who had no particular hurry, because he had, on the whole, no place to be that was urgent, and because hurrying would have suggested a thing he did not wish to suggest. He was met in the antechamber by Hel of Helheim, in the formal robes, with the brazier lit. The cup of warm-not tea was set out. The half of her face that was bone had been polished. The half of her face that was flesh had been arranged to a calm, neutral expression. She was, on the whole, ready. He came in. He took the bench. He took the cup. "Daughter of Loki," he said. "Receiver of many," she said. "I have come to see thy ward. He is waiting in the wider hall. He is 9. He is 9. That is the age at which I begin to take by my own old practice and interest. It is. Has my wife told thee?" "She has." "Then thou art prepared." "I am prepared." He drank the warm-not tea. He drank it slow. The half of her face that was bone watched him, and the half of his face that did not invite remark was watched. After some long moment, he set the cup down. "Bring him." She brought him. She did not, on the whole, walk in front of him. She walked beside him, with the half hand that was flesh on his shoulder, and she set him on the bench beside the receiver of many, and she stood. The receiver of many turned the half-foot turn it took to look at the small mortal ward on the bench beside him. He looked. He looked a long moment. Harry, who had been told what to expect and had been told to be still and had been told to answer if asked, sat with his hands folded on his lap and his feet not quite reaching the floor, and he looked back. He had been looking for 9 years at things that did not have ordinary faces, and he had on the whole the steadier looking of the two. "Boy," said Hades, "what is thy name?" "Harry, sir." "Of what house?" "Of Elgidnir, sir." "By formula or by blood?" "By formula, sir." "Thy blood mother?" "Lily Potter, sir, a working woman, 21 when she died." "Thy blood father?" "James Potter, sir, a working man, 21 when he died." "Thy ward mother?" "Hel of Helheim, sir." "Daughter of Loki Lofajarson, queen of 9 kindly hells." "Thy oaths?" "None taken, sir." "Thy teachers?" "My ward mother, Mr. Loki, who is my uncle. Astrid, who is my friend. Wisp, who is my friend. Ro, who is my friend. The cook, whose name I am not allowed to say outside the hall. Marcus, who is my chess tutor. Sigyn, who is my aunt and visits. Thy crafts?" "Reading, sir, in 3 tongues. Writing, sir, in 2. Counting, sir, to high numbers. The 7 knots of cord that have no working. The 8 knots of cord that have small workings. The voice throwing at the level of stones and corners. Chess, the runes of the long old tongue in the simpler set." "Thy faults?" Harry hesitated. He had not been asked his faults before. He looked briefly up at his mother. She did not give him a sign. She had not been asked. The receiver of many was waiting with the same patient look. "I am sometimes," said Harry, "less patient with the children of the hall than they deserve. I am sometimes proud of my chess. I do not on the whole like Mr. Hermes, although I have not met him, I have heard about him. I do not on the whole like the wraiths, although I am told I should not dislike them, but only nod to them. I am sometimes, when my uncle has lied to me, slow to forgive him." "Thou hast a long list," said Hades. "I have thought about my faults often, sir." "Why?" "Because thinking about them is the way my ward mother says one comes, in time, to fewer of them." The receiver of many turned again, the half-foot turn, and looked at Hel. "Daughter of Loki," he said, "thou hast raised this child." "I have. Among the dead, among the kindly dead, without softening him, and without breaking him, and without breaking him." He looked back at Harry. He nodded once slow. "Boy," he said, "I have been a long time at my work. I have seen a great many children of mortals come in their proper time to my hall. Thou wilt come in thy proper time to a hall thou wilt have chosen by then. Thou hast not chosen yet. I will not press thee. I will say only that, by my old practice, the receiver of many takes an interest at 9 and asks his small list of questions and listens. Thou hast answered. I have listened. I am on the matter of thee content for now. Thank you, sir. My wife sends thee her good wishes. She sent a token. I have it in my sleeve. It is hers, but she asked me to deliver it because she is at her green half and not at her cold half, and the token will not travel between halves except by hand." He produced from his sleeve a small object wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Harry. Harry unwrapped it on his lap. It was a small flat stone, the size of a fingernail, with a single clear green vein in it that gave off the faint warmth of a thing that had spent a long time in a hand. Harry held it. Harry, who had been told to thank gifts in the formal way, said, "I thank the Queen of the Spring and the Winter both for her gift, and I will keep it well, and I will, when I am old enough to write to her, write to her." "That is an acceptable thanking," said Hades. "I will tell her. Thou wilt write to her eventually. She has asked the Queen of this hall for solstice letters, and the Queen has agreed. Thou wilt, when thou art old enough, write the solstice letters yourself, and the Queen will append her own remarks." "Yes, sir." The receiver of many got up slowly. The way men of his weight got up. He bowed, by the small inclination of head, to Hel of Helheim. He bowed by a smaller inclination to Harry. He went with the slow, patient stride he had come with. The cup of warm-not tea was left half-drunk on the bench. When he was out, Hel of Helheim sat down beside her ward. She did not, on the whole, say anything for a while. Harry sat with the small, flat stone in his palm and looked at it. The clear green vein in it held the held light gently. "Mother." Yes, he was kind. He was within his shape. The receiver of many is, on the whole, a kinder man than he is given credit for. He does not advertise it. He does not consider it a virtue worth advertising. He considers it at most an inconvenience that he has to manage by means of bouquets and protests and small visits to 9-year-olds. I shall remember him kindly. Thou shalt. He will not, on the whole, be the worst of thy adult acquaintances when thou hast adult acquaintances. Mother. Yes, when shall I have adult acquaintances? She had been waiting for the question. She had not been waiting for it on this dimming, exactly, but she had been waiting for it. She set her cup down. She looked at the wider hall through the door of the antechamber. The 8 children were across the floor, playing a knuckles game with small bones, in the corner where the held light gathered. "In 2 years," she said, "thou wilt be 11. thou wilt receive a letter from a school in mortal Britain where children of working people are taught the small workings that mortals call magic. Thou wilt have a place there by birthright. Thou wilt go. Thou wilt return at vacations. Thou wilt grow up in part in this hall and in part in that school. It is a long agreed thing. The receiver of many knows. My father knows. Persephone knows. I know. And I and thee now. In 2 years. In 2 years. He thought he held the small flat stone. The green vein in it held the held light gently. He set the stone in the pocket of his tunic. I shall like the children at the school, he said. Some of them. And the teachers. Some of them. And the lessons. Most of them. And I shall miss the hall. Thou wilt also on most of the dimmings return. Yes, mother. She looked at him a long moment. The half of her face that was flesh in the dim light of the held light looked, for the second time in his life, less like flesh and more like something gentler. She did not say what she was thinking. She had not on the whole been a queen who said what she was thinking. She said instead, go and eat, child. The cook has set out a small honey cake. I have it on advice. Yes, mother. He went to eat. The cook who had been waiting gave him the small honey cake, which had been one of the cakes Sigyn had brought 8 years before, and which had been kept in the cool place against his hard-chewing teeth. The cake had not gone stale. The cake was as warm as the morning it had been baked. It tasted of butter and honey. He ate it slow. He saved the last bite for Astrid, who came by, and accepted the bite with the small dignity of a dead child receiving a small kindness, and went on. The brand on his forehead by then was the faintest line. The thing inside it had not, in years, made a thought in the small ward's head. It had given up on the whole the active management of its captivity, and had settled into the slow, patient existence of a guest who has been accommodated longer than he had planned and has stopped, at last, fighting the accommodation. It would in another 2 years be thinner still. It would in 2.5 be barely a thing at all. The hall went on. The dimmings came and went. The small ward grew. The queen kept her ledgers. The 8 children played their long uncomplicated games. The cook fed them all. Loki visited at his own pace and brought small interesting things, and Sigyn came at the solstices with a basket. Persephone wrote, at the solstices, in the formal hand. Hades sent bouquets. The hall on the whole was a kinder hall than it had been before the small ward came, not because the kindness had been absent before, but because the kindness had now a focus, and a focus of kindness in a hall that had been waiting made the hall in small ways lighter. Outside, in the green half of the world, the wraith in the forest in Albania went on floating. He had grown thinner. He had, on the whole, weakened. He had not, on the whole, noticed. He believed he was waiting. He was correct in believing he was waiting. He was incorrect in believing what he was waiting for, but no one, on the whole, was yet inclined to tell him. In Britain, the School of Small Workings prepared its rolls for the year a small ward in Elgidnir would be 11. The small ward's name was already on the roll. It had been on the roll, in fact, since the night the cottage burned. The school's quill had inscribed it that night, and the school's quill had not, since then, withdrawn it. The school's letter had been written and sealed and waited in the Hall of Letters for the proper year. The owls had not yet been told the address. The owls would, when the proper year came, have to be given a difficult address, and the owls would, on the whole, manage it. The small ward did not yet know any of this. He had been told he had 2 years. He had taken the 2 years with the steady patience he took most things. He would be, by then, almost 10. He had a small flat stone in his pocket. He had a thread on his wrist that did not, on the whole, fray. The hall went on. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. A letter from a living place. The owl arrived with frost on its eyelids and a small grievance in its beak. It had not been told the address. It had been given the name and a vague sense of where the boy was, and the school's old delivery working, which had been arranged centuries ago, and had been refined over generations to follow the slow, loose tug of a name written in the school roll, had taken the owl as far as it would take any owl on any errand. The owl had flown it. The owl had crossed mortal Britain in a wind that was easier than usual, had crossed the gray expanse of the North Sea on a wind that was harder, had crossed the long blank country between countries that owls did not, on the whole, like to fly, and had at last found itself on a long road that was not lit because light had no business there. The owl, which had been a working owl in a working post for 9 years and was therefore not easily impressed, had been, for the last hour of its flight, deeply impressed. It had landed at the gate of a hall whose name it had not been told, and the gatekeeper had taken it in, and now it was in the antechamber, and it was very cold, and it was holding a letter in its beak with the same set of professional expression an owl uses to indicate that it is willing to bite if anyone makes a sudden move. Hel of Helheim looked at the owl. She did not, at first, look at the letter. She looked at the owl as a courtesy. The owl looked back with the particular flat orange stare owls reserve for queens who have not yet given them a saucer of water. "Cook," said Hel. The cook came. The cook had been observing from the kitchen door for some minutes and had a saucer of water already prepared. She set the saucer down. The owl considered the saucer for a long second, decided in favor, set the letter down on the bench beside Hel, and drank in the slow professional way of a working owl who would not, by setting down its message, lose track of where the message had gone. Hel picked up the letter. She read the address. It read, Harry Potter, the Bone Cradle, ELJUDNIR, the Hall of Quiet Waiting, HELHEIM. The address was written in green ink. The hand was a precise hand. The paper was a little singed at the corners. The long blank country between countries had not been kind to it. Hel turned the envelope over. The seal was a coat of arms with 4 animals on it, and the legend Draco Dormiens Nunquam Titulindus. She did not at first open it. She set it on her knee. She looked across the antechamber to the door of the great hall, which was open, and through which, from the far corner, Harry could be seen at the chess table with Marcus, and they were in the middle of the White Knight's fork, which Harry was, by then, working with the smooth, practiced hand of a child who had been doing this for several years. She rose. She went to the great hall. She did not, on the whole, hurry. Marcus saw her coming and inclined his head and pushed his chair back. Harry looked up. "Mother." "A letter, child, it is for thee." She handed it to him. He took it and read the address slowly in the long old tongue and then in the mortal tongue, because the address was in the mortal tongue. He looked at the seal. He looked at his mother. "It is the school," he said. "It is the school. I am 11 in 3 months. Thou art 11 in 3 months. The school inscribes its rolls a little ahead. They have remembered thee well." He turned the letter over in his hands. He did not, by long household habit, open the letter at once. One did not, in this hall, open things in front of others without invitation. He looked at his mother for the invitation. She nodded. He opened it. The seal split with the small, clean sound of dry wax. He took out the parchment. He read it slowly, the way he read most things. He was not a slow reader, but he was a careful one, and the parchment had a certain formality to it that invited care. He read it twice. Then he read the second sheet, which was a list. He looked up. "They have a list of school supplies," he said, "most of which I have not heard of. Cauldron pewter, standard size 2, set of brass scales, several books, a wand, a wand, a wand, a wand. They expect us to be in mortal Britain to buy these things. They do. There is a particular street in mortal London where the working people buy their working things. It is called Diagon Alley. We will go. We. Thou and thy uncle. I do not, on the whole, leave the hall. Thy uncle has a fondness for mortal London. Thy uncle will accompany thee." "Yes, mother." She looked at him. The half of her face that was flesh did not, in the held light, change. The half of her face that was bone did not have a way to change, but she set the half hand that was flesh on his shoulder briefly. "Child," she said, "thou wilt go to mortal London with thy uncle. Thou wilt buy thy supplies. Thou wilt be polite to the shopkeepers. Thou wilt not, on any provocation, lie about thy ward mother. Thou wilt, however, not, on most occasions, advertise her either. Thou wilt say, when asked, that thou art a potter, and thou wilt say it without elaboration. Thou wilt let thy uncle handle the elaborations. Thy uncle is good at elaborations. Yes, mother. Thou wilt, when thou meetest the man who killed thy mortal parents, be polite to him." He looked up. He did not say anything. "Thou wilt likely meet him in passing," she said. "He is not in possession of a body he can call his own. He has, on the whole, taken to riding inside other men. He has, on the recent count of the bowls, been riding inside a teacher of thy school, a small thin man named Quirrell, whose head he wraps in a turban. Teacher has not, by the look of him, much longer to live as a teacher, but in the meantime he is a teacher, and he goes from time to time to a tavern called the Leaky Cauldron, and that tavern is the gate to Diagon Alley. Thou wilt likely encounter him in the tavern. Thou wilt not, on encountering him, do anything about him. Thou wilt nod courteously the way thou hast learned to nod to wraiths in the lower quarter. Thou wilt walk on. Thou wilt let him observe thee. He will make of thee what he can. He will not, I think, find what he expects to find. Yes, mother, thy uncle will be there. Thy uncle will manage matters if anything goes amiss. Thou hast nothing to do but learn the streets and the faces, and buy thy supplies and come home." "Yes, mother." She regarded him. He regarded her. The owl by the brazier had finished its water. The owl professionally gave a small low hoot which meant, "When may I go?" "Cook," said Hel. "Find the owl a piece of meat. Send it on its way with a sealed reply." She turned to Harry. "Thou wilt write the reply. The school will appreciate the politeness." "Yes, mother." He sat at the small writing table by the brazier. He took up the quill, which was a quill he had been using for several years, and which had been, at one stage, given to him by Loki, and was, in its way, a piece of work in itself. He wrote in the precise formal hand the cook had taught him. To the headmaster and the deputy headmistress and the staff of the school, I, Harry Potter, of the house of Elgidnir, ward of Hell of Helheim, accept thy invitation and shall be in attendance on the first day of the term. I thank thee for the inscription on thy rolls. I shall obtain my supplies in Diagon Alley with my uncle, who will bring me. I shall be at the platform on the morning. With courtesy, Harry Potter. He read it. He folded it. He sealed it with a small disk of frost the cook had given him for the purpose. He handed it to the owl, which had been given a piece of meat in the meantime, and was, on the whole, mollified. The owl took the letter in its beak with care. The owl bowed in the small professional bow of an owl which has been treated well and went. The hall went on. Loki arrived 3 dimmings later in his own face. He had heard. He always heard. He had also already gone, as he liked to do, to a tailor's in mortal London and arranged for himself a set of clothes that he could wear without giving offense. The clothes were a long coat of a charcoal wool, and a pair of trousers of darker charcoal wool, and a waistcoat with 3 small buttons of bone, and a soft hat of gray felt, and a pair of polished black boots. He had also arranged for himself, while he was at it, a name and a set of small papers. The name was Mr. L. Liasmith. The small papers were forged with the quiet thoroughness of a god who had been forging small papers for centuries, and he was, in the eyes of any mortal he was likely to meet, a gentleman of indeterminate origin and a comfortable income. He had also arranged for Harry a set of clothes that did not, on the whole, advertise the country he had been raised in. The clothes were a coat of a charcoal wool slightly lighter than Loki's, a soft cap, and a pair of trousers. The cook had set them aside on a shelf where Harry could not, by accident, see them in the dimmings before the visit. Loki, on the day, presented the clothes. "Thou wilt look like a respectable boy from the country," he said, as Harry put the coat on. "Thou hast outfitted me as if I were going to a funeral. Thou art going to mortal London, child. Mortal London in the late summer is very nearly a funeral. The mortals do not know it. They are unhappier than they admit. The clothes will pass without remark. I have a question, uncle. Ask. Thou hast, on this trip, planned a number of mischiefs. That is not a question, child. I have phrased it as a statement to spare us both an awkward asking. Thou art quick, child. Yes, I have planned a number of mischiefs. They are small. They will not embarrass thy mother. They will, in fact, please her if she ever hears of them. She will not hear of them because thou wilt not tell her, and I will not tell her because we do not, on the whole, give her unsolicited reports. Thou understand. I understand, uncle. Then we shall have a good day. They went. The way to mortal London from the gate of Helheim was, in the long old practice, a way that did not pass through any country it could be tracked by. Loki took it. Harry, who had not been outside the hall in his memory, walked beside him with his hand in Loki's hand, and watched, and said nothing. The way passed through a long dim corridor in which pale fish hung in dim water on ledges, through a stairwell of 40 steps that ascended this time rather than descended, through a long plain road that was lit, in his memory's first reckoning of suns, by a held sun, although the sun was the small old sun of an in-between country and did not, on the whole, warm, and at the end of the road, by a small unremarkable arch, they stepped out into a back alley of London. The back alley smelled of damp brick and old chip-fat. Harry, who had been told what mortal London smelled of and had thought himself prepared, found that he had not been prepared. He breathed slow twice. He looked up at his uncle. Loki, in the soft gray hat, looked down at him. Thou art well, child. It smells, uncle. It does. It is in places loud. It is. We shall be in a quieter place in 2 minutes' walk. The leaky cauldron is at the end of this lane. The lane on the way in is loud. The lane on the way out will also be loud. In the middle there is the tavern, and beyond the tavern there is the alley we are going to, which is louder still in places, but which has, on the whole, a richer set of smells. Thou wilt manage. Yes, uncle. They walked. The Leaky Cauldron was a low old tavern with a sign that was rusted to the point of illegibility, and a door that had been opened and closed enough times to wear a hollow at the threshold. Loki opened the door and held it for Harry. Harry walked in. The room was low-ceilinged and dim and smelled of pipe smoke and old beer and a fainter background smell of something Harry, with his nose for these things, identified as a slow-leaking small working under the floorboards, the kind of working a tavern accumulated by simple long use. The room had perhaps 14 people in it. They were of varying ages. They were dressed, on the whole, in the loose flowing robes that mortals who did the small workings had decided, several centuries before, were the proper costume for their trade. They were, on the whole, drinking. They had, on the whole, been drinking for some time. The room went silent when Harry walked in. This was not, by the small calculations of the room, a thing that had been planned. The room had not, by long habit, gone silent for boys in coats, even respectable boys in coats with their respectable uncles. The room had gone silent because the small working under the floorboards had, on Harry's entering, registered something unexpected, and the small working had communicated this unexpectedness, in the way taverns communicated such things to the room. The room, on the whole, had not been told what was unexpected. The room had simply felt the unexpectedness and had paused. Loki, who had felt the pause, did not let it last. He stepped forward. He took off his hat. He inclined his head courteously to the bartender, who was a small, tall, stooped man with a wandering eye. "Tom," he said, "2 glasses of small beer, if you please. The boy shall have 1. He is 11 and is allowed." Liasmith, said Tom, who had not, in the small confusion, seen the visitor walk in. "It's been an age, and the young gentleman is my nephew," said Loki smoothly. "Up from the country. Today is his 11th, and we are come to the alley for his school things." From the country. "Of course, sir." The room, on hearing the small explanation, did not, on the whole, return to its previous state of conversation. The room remained quiet. Several of the heads in the room turned, slow, to take a longer look at the boy in the charcoal coat. Boy in the charcoal coat, who had been raised among the dead and had been told to nod courteously to wraiths, nodded courteously to the room. The nod was the small, precise nod of a child who had been taught the nodding by a queen. The room, on receiving the nod, blinked collectively and looked away. Tom set the glasses on the bar. Loki paid. Loki took up his glass and set Harry's glass within Harry's reach. Harry, who had not, in his memory, drunk small beer, took up the glass with both hands and tasted it. The taste was small and bitter and mostly water. He set it down. "It is mostly water, uncle." "It is. Mortals are cautious with their children. Ours is cautious with us in different ways. Drink it, child. It is courteous to drink what is set before thee." "Yes, uncle." He drank. He set the glass down empty, slow, and then he became aware, in the small old way of a child who has been raised in a hall full of shades, that there was a thing in the room that did not belong in the room. The thing in the room was at the back, by the fire. The thing in the room was a man in a dark turban and a robe the color of bad coffee. The man was thin, his hands were thin, his face, what could be seen of it under the turban, was the face of a man who had not eaten well in a long time and had not, on the whole, slept well in a longer time. The man was looking at Harry. The man was, in fact, staring at Harry. The man's eyes were a weak, watery blue. They were not in themselves hostile. They were the eyes of a small, frightened man. But behind the eyes of the small, frightened man was another set of eyes, which Harry, who had been told to expect this, recognized at once. The other set of eyes was not blue. The other set of eyes was the color of the rune mark above his own. The other set of eyes was looking at Harry through the small, frightened man's eyes, and the other set of eyes had, on the moment of looking, recoiled. The man behind the man had recoiled because the man behind the man had, in that recoiling, recognized a thing he had not known about himself. The piece of him that had been left in Godric's hollow had been a long time gone. It had, by his understanding, been gone to the boy. He had, by his expectation, on coming near the boy, felt the small tug of the bond with the piece. He felt instead a small, clean, cold absence, where the bond had been, and the cold absence was not a kindly cold, it was the cold of his own peace, returned to him as a small, clean blank, washed of his anger, washed of his hate, washed by a weather he had no name for. He did not know about Helheim. He had not heard about Helheim. He had not paid attention to the bowls. He had spent the last decade in a forest in Albania feeling sorry for himself, and possessing, in turn, a small succession of bodies that did not, on the whole, hold him well. And now he was riding the back of the head of a small, thin man named Quirinus Quirrell, and he was at the leaky cauldron because Quirinus Quirrell had had to come for a meeting with another teacher, and he had not expected, on this evening, to be looking at a small mortal boy in a charcoal coat, and he had not expected, in particular, to be looking at the absence of his own anchor. He recoiled hard. The teacher's body, which had not been told he was recoiling, jerked slightly, and the teacher's hand spilled the glass of mead the teacher had been holding. The mead pooled on the table. The teacher made a small, distressed sound. Harry, who had been watching with the steady gaze of a child who had walked past wraiths without flinching, nodded courteously to "Sir," said Harry, in the polite, small voice of a respectable boy from the country. "I beg your pardon. I did not mean to startle you." The teacher's mouth made several shapes. None of them in the end were words. "Tom," said Loki smoothly, picking up his hat, "we shall be on our way. The boy is on a schedule. Good evening to the room. Good evening to you, sir," he added, with a small inclination of head to the man in the turban that was not quite a bow and not quite not, and was in any case not an inclination of head Harry had been taught. They left. The alley behind the tavern was narrow and bricked and ended on the back wall in a small alcove with 3 mismatched bricks. Loki tapped the bricks. The wall opened slow in the way of walls that knew their job and did not, on the whole, hurry. They walked through. Diagon Alley unfolded. It was, even for a child who had been raised in a hall of bone, a great deal at once. The shops crowded each other with the slow, happy aggression of shops that had been competing for centuries and had developed, accordingly, a kind of mutual stylistic exuberance. There were cauldrons stacked outside potages. There were brooms on a rack outside quality Quidditch supplies. There were owls clustered in the window of Aeolus, looking critically at the passers-by. There was an apothecary with jars in the window in colors Harry could not, at first, name. There was an ice cream parlor with a sign showing a man in a tall hat eating, theatrically, 3 flavors at once. There was, at the far end, a tall white building with crooked angles and pillars that Harry knew from his lessons was the bank. "We shall do the bank first," said Loki. "Then the books, then the wand, then the small things, then we shall go home." "Yes, uncle." They went to the bank. The bank was Gringotts. The bank was, on the inside, taller than it had any right to be on the outside. Its ceilings were high and its floors were polished marble, and the pillars rose up into a height that did not, on careful reckoning, exist. The clerks at the bank were goblins. The goblins were short and sharp-featured and had hands that looked, on the whole, like they would have been good at carving small, precise things, although the goblins, as a profession, had long ago decided not to. The goblins kept ledgers. The goblins were, from a certain angle, not unlike the Queen of Helheim. They had ledgers, they kept them. They did not, on the whole, hurry. The goblin at the front desk looked up as Loki and Harry approached. The goblin's eyes, which were a slow-moving black, flicked in the small, precise way that goblins' eyes flicked, from Loki to Harry, and then they paused on Harry, and the pausing was a longer pausing than the flicking had been, and the goblin's mouth made a small, tight movement that was, in the goblin trade, the equivalent of a long whistle. "Good morning," said Loki, smoothly. "My nephew has come to make a withdrawal from his vault. He has the key." He produced the key, which had been one of the small pieces of paper and metal he had arranged for in advance. He set it on the counter. The goblin examined the key. The goblin looked at Harry again. The goblin's eyes flicked again to Loki. The goblin said in a slow, careful voice, "Mr. Liasmith." "Yes, and the young gentleman is." "Mr. Potter," said Loki. "The vault is in his name." "It is. We have in our records the vault of one Harry James Potter, established by his parents, kept by us in trust, accessible to the heir on his 11th birthday or by approved guardian before that date. The young gentleman is approved by guardian on his current visit, by the documents on file. He is. And the documents on file include his ward mother." The goblin paused. The goblin set the key down on the counter, slow. "Mr. Liasmith," said the goblin, in the careful voice goblins used for the more interesting clients. "Our records on this vault have been, in the last decade, the source of several internal inquiries. We had, when the vault was opened, inscribed it as the vault of a child whose ward had been taken by a queen. We had not, on the whole, fully understood what queen. We have in the years since learned. We have updated our records. We have been thorough. You are always thorough. We are. We had in our last update marked the vault as Potter in Trust, ward of the Queen of Helheim. We are not in the goblin trade, accustomed to using the word Queen of Helheim in our records, but we have used it. We are, in our small way, prepared. Excellent. The young gentleman may withdraw what he likes." "Thank you," the goblin gestured. Another goblin came up. The two of them led Loki and Harry through a tall door, and down a long stair and onto a small cart with a little brass bell, and the cart went down through a tunnel of carved black rock at a speed that was not quite respectable, and Harry, who had been raised on the slow, patient, steady walking of his ward mother, found that the cart was, in its own way, a small, interesting workings. The cart stopped at the door of a vault. The goblin opened the vault. The vault contained, in the slow-held light of the bank's deep working, a heap of gold and silver and bronze coins that had been, on the whole, untouched for 10 years. Harry took, on Loki's instruction, a small leather sack that Loki had brought and filled it and tied it again. He did not, on the whole, take more than he had been told to take. He had not been raised to greed. He had been raised by a queen who kept ledgers. He understood that a sack from a vault was an entry in a ledger that was, itself, going to have to be kept, and he was not, on his first visit, going to make the keeping of the ledger more complicated than it had to be. They came back up. The goblin nodded to him as he passed. The goblin's eyes paused again on his forehead. Harry nodded back. The goblin, who in his line of work had nodded to a great many small mortals over the years, made a small note in the slow, private goblin tongue that meant, "This one is interesting," and went on. They went to the bookshop. The bookshop was flourish and blots. The bookshop was in places, 4 stories of books arranged on shelves that in the higher stories leaned. The leaning was deliberate, and the books were leaned with, and the bookshop was, in its way, a working in itself. Loki had a list. The list was the list from the parchment. They walked it. The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1, by Miranda Gosshawk. A History of Magic by Bathilda Bagshot. Magical Theory by Adalbert Waffling. A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration by Emeric Switch. 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi by Phillida Spore. Magical Drafts and Potions by Arsenius Jigger. Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them by Newt Scamander. The Dark Forces, A Guide to Self-Protection by Quentin Trimble. They bought all 8. Harry, who liked books, looked at each of them with the steady curiosity he gave to most new things, and Loki, who was a god of mischief, allowed him the small pleasure without comment. They bought, additionally and on Loki's quiet recommendation, a small slim volume of Norse runes that had not been on the school list, and a battered second-hand copy of Beetle, the Bard's Tales for Children that the shopkeeper, on Loki's small smile, included for free. The total bill was paid out of the leather sack. The sack was lighter going out than coming in. They went to the apothecary and bought scales and glass phials and a small starter set of standard ingredients. They went to the cauldron shop and bought a cauldron pewter, standard size 2, exactly as the parchment had asked. They went to the robe shop and stood with patient resignation, while a witch in a striped overdress took Harry's measurements with a wandering tape that, when not held, drifted away to measure things on the shelf. The witch made the school robes in the school robe pattern. She also, on Loki's quiet word and a small extra coin, lined the inside of the school robes with a charcoal wool that had a small set of runes embroidered into the seam in white silk thread. The runes were the runes of the long old tongue, and they were, in their small way, against ill working, and they would not, on the whole, do anything obvious, but they would, in the way of small old workings, make ill workings find Harry slightly less interesting than they otherwise would. The witch did not ask about the runes. The witch had been a long time in her trade and had learned not to ask. They went last to the wand shop. The wand shop was Ollivander's. The wand shop was a narrow shop in a narrow street, with a single wand on a single cushion in the dusty window, and a small bell above the door that rang when they walked in, with the small distinct sound of a bell that had been made by a careful hand. The shop was lined with shelves. The shelves were full of long, thin boxes. The long, thin boxes were full of wands. The wands, by long old habit, slept. Mr. Ollivander came out from the back of the shop. He was a small, thin man with pale, watery eyes. His eyes had the particular flat shine that the eyes of certain working people had, the shine of a man who had spent his life looking at workings instead of at faces, and whose face had, in consequence, gone slightly out of focus. "Mr. Potter," he said, before Harry had introduced himself, "I had wondered when I should see you. 11 years, a long time. Come in, come in." "Sir," said Harry, in the polite small voice of a respectable boy from the country. "And the gentleman is?" "His uncle," said Loki smoothly. "L. Liasmith. I have brought him for his wand." "You have? Good, good, Mr. Potter." The pale eyes settled on Harry's face with the long, careful focus the pale eyes had. "I sold your father his wand, a fine wand, mahogany, 11 inches, pliable, excellent for transfiguration. I sold your mother her wand, a lovely wand, willow, 10¼ inches, swishy, nice for charms, very. Yours, however, will be its own. Wands choose, Mr. Potter, we do not." "Yes, sir, your wand arm." Harry held out his right hand. The tape, which had been measuring him by drifting away to measure other things, drifted to him and measured the length of his arm and the breadth of his shoulders, and with the quiet professional liberty of an old tape, the distance from one nostril to the other. Mr. Ollivander observed all of this slow and turned away to the shelves. He came back with a wand. He handed it to Harry. Nothing happened. He took it back and brought another. Nothing happened. He took it back. He went up the shelves. He came down with a third. Nothing happened. He paused. He looked at Harry. "Tricky customer," he said, with the small, distant pleasure of a wandmaker who had on the whole his best afternoons with the tricky customers. "Let us try, perhaps." He went up the shelves. He came down with a long, thin box that had a layer of dust on it. He blew the dust off. He opened the box. The wand inside was holly and pale and had a careful balance about it. He handed it to Harry. The wand, which had been sleeping, woke. It was a small waking. Harry, who had spent his life in a hall where workings did not advertise themselves, felt the waking in the small private place at the base of his sternum where workings woke. The wand in his hand did not, on the whole, show off. It made a small sound, like a fingernail on a string, and the dust on the shelves of the shop in the held light lifted very slightly and settled again. Mr. Ollivander, who was looking at the wand and not at Harry, made the small, distant, pleased sound he made on the better afternoons. Curious, he said. Curious, curious. Sir, Holly, 11 inches, phoenix feather. The phoenix that gave the feather for that wand gave one other feather, Mr. Potter. Just one. The other feather went into another wand, one that you may find, as you mature in your workings, has been associated with a great deal of unpleasantness. The wand that gave that other feather is, by my old records, the wand that gave you the scar on your forehead. I see. Curious. Yes, sir. It is, in its way, a small old joke of the wand trade. Wands of the same heart sometimes seek balance with each other, Mr. Potter. The other wand and yours are, in their way, brothers. They will not, when they meet, do what their wielders ask of them, or rather they will do something nearer to what is needed than to what is asked. The wand trade has a phrase for this, but I shall not bore you with it. You are not boring me, sir. You are kind. Sir, may I ask, has the other wand been in recent years used? Mr. Ollivander looked at him. The pale, watery eyes had, for a half-second, the smallest sharpening that Harry had seen yet in mortal Britain. The pale, watery eyes saw through, in that half-second, several layers of careful country boy. Very rarely in the last decade, said Mr. Ollivander. But it has, in the last fortnight, been used. I should add that I do not, by my records, know who is using it. The other wand was last sold to a young man who did not, in the end, do what young men were expected to do with their wands. The records show the wand returned to the trade. The records do not show it sold again, but it has been used. The wand trade has its own ways of knowing. I see. Take care of yours, Mr. Potter. Yours is a good wand, well-balanced, pleasant in the hand, and it has a brother that has in the past made a great deal of mess. Good wands sometimes take after their brothers. Good wands sometimes do not. Yes, sir. Loki paid for the wand. Loki added a discreet additional coin for the small information. Mr. Ollivander accepted both with the same small, careful nod. He boxed the wand. He set the box in Harry's hand. Good day, Mr. Potter. Good day, sir. They went out. The street was full of late afternoon working people in flowing robes. The light was the small, thin yellow of August in London, which had nothing to do with the held light of Elgidnere, but which Harry, who had not seen August before, recognized at once as a pleasant cousin to it. He held the box with the wand in his right hand. He held the leather sack with the school books and the small ingredients in his left. He looked at his uncle. Uncle, child, there is something I should tell my mother. Yes, he recoiled. Yes, my piece of him is gone. Yes. He will in time come for me again. He will, thou art prepared. Ami Loki in the soft gray hat looked down at his nephew for a long second. He did not, by long old habit, lie about preparation. He had lied about a great many small things, but preparation was a thing he did not lie about. He had lied about the small undoing not. He had not lied about preparation. Thou art prepared, he said after a moment, as prepared as any child could be. Thou hast been raised in a hall of bone. Thou hast been taught the 7 knots and the 8 knots and the small undoing knot. Thou hast learned to throw thy voice. Thou hast learned to play chess. Thou hast learned the etiquette of wraiths. Thou hast a cloak with runes in the seam. Thou hast a wand whose brother gave thee thy scar. Thou hast a mother who is the queen of Helheim. Thou art prepared. Thou art, in fact, more prepared than is, on the whole, fair to anyone who comes after thee. He will come for thee. Thou wilt manage. We shall not, on this evening, dwell on it. Yes, uncle, thou wilt now have an ice cream. An ice cream. It is a thing mortal boys have on August evenings in London after their first day of buying their school things. Thou wilt have one, because thy mother will ask, when we come home, what thou hast had, and I shall not be able to tell her thou hast not had an ice cream. I shall like the ice cream. Thou shalt. They went to the parlor. The man in the tall hat painted on the sign watched them come in. The man behind the counter served them, 3 flavors at once on Loki's insistence. Harry sat at a small round iron table on the pavement with a glass dish of 3 flavors and ate it slow, with the steady enjoyment he gave to most things, and did not, on the whole, hurry. Loki, who had his own glass, ate his slower still. They went home by the way they had come. They stepped out in the back alley of London, into a long plain road that was lit by the small old sun of an in-between country, and along the road, and down the stairwell of 40 steps that descended this time, and through the corridor of pale fish and dim water, and through the gate of Helheim, which had been left open for them by the gatekeeper, and into the antechamber. Hel of Helheim was at her chair in the great hall. She did not rise. She had not, on the whole, expected them to be late. She looked at them across the floor. Mother, child, I have my supplies. I have my wand. Holly, 11 inches, phoenix feather, the brother of the wand of the man who killed my mortal parents. I had thought it would be. He recoiled in the tavern. The piece of him on my brow is gone, or near enough. I had thought it would be. I had an ice cream. She looked at him a long moment. The half of her face that was flesh in the held light of the hall did not change. The half of her face that was bone did not have a way to change. But she rose slowly from the chair, and she crossed the floor, and she put the half hand that was bone on the side of his head, and the half hand that was flesh on the other side, and she held him, briefly, in the small, precise manner of a queen who had not held many small mortal boys in her life, and was, on the whole, glad of the experience. "Welcome home," she said. "I am glad to be home, mother. Now go and tell Marcus thou hast bought thyself a wand. He will want to see it. He has not seen a wand in 1300 years. He shall be impressed, and he shall pretend not to be." "Yes, mother." He went. The hall went on. Loki to his daughter said. He nodded at the man in the turban, daughter, with a courtesy thou wouldst have approved of. I had hoped he would. He did. Then we have a month before the term and a small list of remaining preparations. I have a list as well, daughter. I shall match it against then over supper. Father, daughter, thy list shall not include the small undoing knot. It shall not. I have on this trip lied to him about nothing further. Be it noted. It is noted. The hall went on. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. King's Cross. The platform existed between two other platforms in the way certain useful things existed in mortal Britain, which was to say that it was not on the schedule, and that the people who used it had been told, separately, where to put their hands. Loki, on the morning, had Harry by the elbow and a trunk trolley in front of him. The trolley had Harry's school trunk on it, and the school trunk had, by long careful packing in the cradle room of Elgidnir, all of his books and his cauldron and his scales and his school robes lined with the runes. And on top of the trunk was a small wicker carrier with a snowy owl in it, the owl having been Loki's parting gift the night before, presented in the great hall with a small unceremonious bow and a remark to the effect that a working boy needed working post. The owl had been called Hedwig by the cook, who said the name fit, and the cook's namings in this hall tended to stick. Hedwig had not, in any of the 9 hours since her arrival, voiced an objection. "Brick walls," said Loki in the tone of a man who had done this several times. "Between platform 9 and platform 10, walk through, briskly, do not pause. The mortals around us are as a rule not paying attention. They are, however, paying enough attention to notice if a boy stops in front of a brick wall and looks at it. We do not, on the whole, advertise. Yes, uncle, I shall come through after thee. Yes, uncle." He walked. He did not pause. The brick wall was as solid as a brick wall ought to be, until it was not, and then he was through. The platform on the other side smelled of coal smoke and damp, and the slow live smell of a great many small workings packed in trunks and cages. The Hogwarts Express was at the platform. It was scarlet and brass and old, and was venting steam in long white slow exhalations the way a horse vents breath after a run, and it had in places the same kind of cared-for and slightly worn quality as the cottage at Godric's Hollow had had on the morning of its photographing. Harry, who had been raised in a hall where things were mostly bone and stone and held light, looked at the train with the steady curiosity he gave to most new things. Loki came through behind him. Loki had, with the small adjustment of his face, taken on the look of a tall, thin gentleman in a charcoal coat and a soft gray hat, who was a respectable boy's respectable uncle, who was on the platform to see the boy off and would not, on the whole, embarrass him. The look was a small, careful working that Harry had been told about a long time ago and had been allowed on this morning to watch being put on. The face was Loki's face, on the whole, only the small calibrations had been adjusted. He did not, in this shape, draw the eye. He drew, instead, the small, respectful oversight that an indifferent mortal gave a respectable elder. "There," he said, pointing, "carriage in the middle. Less crowded, find a compartment with seats. I shall help thee with the trunk. The owl shall ride beside thee." They walked the platform. The platform had, on the whole, several hundred people on it. The people were, on the whole, in robes. Some of the smaller children had not yet been changed into their robes and were in mortal-style clothes that, by the look of them, had been bought for the term and would not be unpacked again until December. There were parents kissing children. There were younger siblings being lifted to be kissed. There were small explosions of glitter from the trunks of older children with theatrical taste. There was a fat ginger cat being smuggled, badly, in a basket. There was a toad that had escaped its box and was being chased with decreasing patience by a round-faced boy. There was, in a corner, a boy in a green and silver scarf who was pretending not to be excited and was failing. Harry, who had walked among the 8 long-dead children of Elgidnir and had walked past the wraiths in the lower quarter, looked at the platform with the steady gaze of a child who had been raised on a great deal more interesting company, and was, on the whole, prepared to find this particular crowd a little soft, a little small, and a little dear. He did not say so. He had been raised not to say so. He had been raised, in particular, not to advertise his preparation. Loki settled the trunk in a compartment in the middle carriage. He set the carrier on the seat. He stepped down. He stood on the platform by the open door. Harry stood inside by the window. "Mr. Lyesmith," said Harry in the small, precise voice of a respectable nephew, "Mr. Potter, thou wilt go home and tell my mother I am well. I shall. Thou wilt also tell her that the platform is loud and the train smells of coal. I shall. Thou wilt also tell her that the platform contained no one of any note, by which I mean no one she would be displeased to hear thy report on. I shall. Thou wilt also tell her, child, yes, she knows already. I shall tell her thou hast settled. Sit, read thy book, be respectful to thy compartment mates. Do not on the way demonstrate the small undoing knot, the voice throwing, or the small precise nodding to wraiths thou hast been taught. Do on the way demonstrate the chess. Some of thy compartment mates may know it. Yes, uncle, be well, child, be well, uncle." He stepped back. He took off the soft gray hat. He inclined his head, the small precise inclination he had been giving hell for years. He did not, on the platform, smile. He had been raised in a hall where smiles were not the currency, and Harry, being his daughter's child by formula, had been raised in the same currency, and they had between them a long-settled understanding that the absence of smile was not the absence of feeling. The whistle blew. The doors closed. The train began, in the slow, patient way of trains, to move. Harry sat. He took out a book from the trunk. He set the carrier on the seat opposite. He read. He did not read, on the whole, the school book. He read, instead, the small, slim volume of Norse runes Loki had bought him at Flourish and Blots. He had been working through it for 3 weeks. The runes in the book were the runes of the long old tongue, in a different order from the order he had learned, and he had been finding the differences, and he had been, in his way, slowly enjoying them. The compartment door slid open. The boy who slid it open had a long nose and red hair that was, on his head, doing more or less what it wanted. He had a round, freckled face, and a slightly grimy mark on his nose which he had not yet noticed, and a school robe that was, on close look, slightly too short at the wrist. He had a school trunk in the corridor behind him that had a luggage label on it reading WSLEY in a careful adult hand. "Anyone sitting here?" he said, in the careful tone of a boy who had on the train been turned away from 1 or 2 compartments already and was, on the whole, getting tired of asking. "Nobody," said Harry, looking up. "Thanks," said the boy. He came in. He pushed the trunk into the rack with the kind of effort that suggested the trunk had a great many books in it that the books had decided not to cooperate. He sat down opposite. He looked at Harry. He looked at the owl. He looked at Harry's forehead. He did not, by the small hesitation in his face, want to look at Harry's forehead. He had, by the small hesitation, been taught not to stare at the foreheads of strangers. He had also, by the longer hesitation, been taught the names of certain foreheads, and his eyes had, against his manners, drifted there. He looked away. "I'm Ron Weasley," he said, "Harry Potter." The carriage door in the corridor was a long, narrow thing with a brass handle, and the brass handle had the small, distant sound brass handles had when they had been made in 1911 and had been polished by station cleaners every Tuesday since. The carriage door did not, on Harry's saying his name, swing open with any drama. The corridor outside had 1 or 2 passing students who did not, on the whole, look in. The world went on. Ron Weasley's mouth, however, did several things at once and settled on a soft, astonished, "Oh, are you really?" he said. "I am," said Harry. "Have a seat, you already have." It is all right, Mr. Weasley. I have been told to expect this." Ron looked at him. Ron's red hair on his head did its usual things. Ron's freckles did not, on the whole, react. "Have you got the scar?" "Yes, I have. Can I?" "Yes." Harry pushed up the soft cap he had been wearing, and his hair, which had a tendency to be a nuisance to anyone attempting to comb it, fell back, and the small, thin, pale line on his forehead was visible, faint enough that it was not the brand it had been on the night of its making, and not yet quite invisible. Ron looked. Ron made the small, soft, astonished sound of a boy who had been told a story and was now seeing the page he had been told it from. "It's small," he said. "It has," said Harry, "shrunk." "It has, I have been," said Harry, with the very slight pause of a child who had been told to manage his elaborations, "in a place where it has had time to shrink. In a place. In a place you are not the first to ask. You shall not be the last. I do not, on the whole, advertise the place." "Right." Ron sat. Ron took, after a minute, out of his pocket a small package wrapped in wax paper which contained 4 sandwiches. The sandwiches had been made by his mother. Ron opened them. The sandwiches were, by the smell, corned beef. Ron made a small wry face at them, the wry face of a boy who had been eating corned beef sandwiches for the 11 years of his life and had, on the whole, expected something different on the train. He held one out. "Want one?" Yes, you don't have to be. No, please, I should like one. Harry took the sandwich. He ate it. He was, by the long, quiet practice of the Cook of Elgidnir, a slow eater and a thorough one, and he ate the sandwich with the steady appreciation he gave to most new foods. The sandwich was not as good as the cook's small honey cakes. The sandwich was, in its way, perfectly all right. My mum makes them, said Ron. She always makes corned beef. I keep telling her I don't like corned beef. She keeps making them. That is a kindness on her part. It is. You were going to say it isn't. I was. But you put it that way, and now I can't. That is, in my hall, the most useful manner of putting things. My ward mother taught me. Your ward mother, the woman who has been raising me. Have a sandwich. It's mine. It is. Have it back. Ron, who had been about to ask a question, found himself, by the small redirection of the tongue, eating his own sandwich. He ate it with the surprised expression of a boy who has lost an argument without having, in the precise transcript, ever actually had won. Harry ate his slow. Outside, the train passed countryside that was greener than any countryside Harry had ever seen. Some time later, the trolley came around. The trolley was pushed by a witch with a pleasant face and a great many small drawers. Harry, who had a small leather sack in his pocket from the bank, bought, on Ron's bewildered watch, a great deal of confectionery. He bought, in particular, a stack of chocolate frogs that the witch said was not quite the largest stack she had sold that morning, but was the largest stack she had sold that morning to a first year. He bought also several boxes of Bertie Bott's every flavor beans, a couple of pasties, a bag of jelly slugs, and 3 pumpkin pasties. I don't, Ron began, in the careful tone of a boy who had been brought up not to take what he could not pay back. It would be a kindness to me, said Harry, if thou wouldst eat half of these. I have not eaten mortal sweets in my memory. I do not know what is good. I shall need a guide. You shouldn't. I am offering thee the position of guide, Mr. Weasley. Take it or do not. Ron took it. Ron took it with the round-eyed enthusiasm of a boy who had not, in his life, been offered the position of guide, and who had on the whole been given the impression by many of his older brothers that the position of guide was a position other people occupied. He ate, on Harry's invitation, 2 of every flavor. He explained, on the way through them, the small lore of each. He explained the small lore of chocolate frogs, the cards inside, the way the cards were collected, the famous wizards on them. He explained the small lore of Bertie Bott's, the lottery aspect, the well-known disasters, the legend of his Uncle Bilious and the tripe-flavored bean. The compartment door slid open a second time. The girl who slid it open had a great deal of brown hair, even teeth, a robe that was on her in advance of the rest of the carriage having changed into theirs, a wand in her hand by way of demonstration, and the look of a person who had walked the length of the train at least 3 times and had developed, accordingly, a small efficient frown. Has anyone seen a toad? She said. A boy named Neville's lost one. No, said Harry. No, said Ron with his mouth full. Oh, she said. She did not on the whole leave. She looked instead at the small cluster of confectionery on the seat between Harry and Ron, and at Harry, and at Ron, and at the wand on Ron's lap which Ron had been about to demonstrate a charm with. Are you doing magic? Let's see. Said Ron. Go on. Ron, who had not, on the whole, been about to do magic so much as he had been about to make a casual effort that he hoped would look like magic, cleared his throat. He said, with the conviction of a boy who had been taught the words by his older brother Fred and had not in advance fully checked them, Sunshine, daisies, buttermellow, turn this stupid, fat rat yellow. He waved the wand. The rat, which was on his lap and which had been asleep, woke briefly and made the small unimpressed face of a rat being addressed as a stupid fat rat. That, said the girl, is not a real spell. I have tried a few simple spells just for practice, and they have all worked for me. Nobody in my family is magic at all. It was such a surprise when I got my letter. But I was ever so pleased, of course, I mean. It's the very best school of witchcraft there is, I've heard. I've learnt all our set books off by heart, of course. I just hope it will be enough. I'm Hermione Granger, by the way. Who are you? She had said this in a single quick run, without comma or breath. She had said it like a person who had been told, somewhere in the early part of her childhood, that the way to make people listen was to leave them no place to interrupt. She finished. She drew, finally, breath. She looked at Ron expectantly. Ron Weasley, said Ron, who had been, by the small mid-sentence confusion, slightly scrambled. And you, Harry Potter. She did not, on the whole, react in the way Ron had reacted. She tilted her head a half-inch. Her eyes flicked to his forehead, the half-second flick that Ron's eyes had also done. She did not, on the whole, dwell. Are you really? I know all about you, of course. I got a few extra books for background reading, and you're in modern magical history and the rise and fall of the dark arts and great wizarding events of the 20th century. AMI, you are. What do they say? They say, she stopped. The stopping was a small, careful stopping. She had been on her way to produce, with the eager helpfulness of a girl who had read a great deal of background reading, several paragraphs from several textbooks, and had stopped because she had, in the half-second between the question and her answer, observed Harry's face. Harry's face was not the face of a boy who wanted to be told the things they said. Harry's face was the face of a boy who knew the things they said, who knew that the things they said were, on the whole, not what had happened, and who was waiting, with the steady patience he gave to most things, for her to decide whether to read the textbooks at him or to ask him. Actually, said Hermione Granger after a measurable pause, I should rather hear what you say, about yourself. Harry, who had been raised by a queen who answered questions truthfully and not always in the order asked, considered. I was raised, he said, by my ward mother in a hall I am not, on the whole, allowed to describe in detail to people I have not known for more than an hour. My ward mother is not a witch in the sense your books mean. The man your books call he who must not be named killed my mortal parents. He attempted that night to kill me. He was prevented by a working of my mortal mother's that has not, in the books I have seen, been correctly described. The piece of him that was left in me has, in the 11 years since, been removed. He did not know, when I met him a month ago in a tavern in London, that this was so. He was, by his expression, not pleased. I have a wand of holly and phoenix feather. I am, in chess, somewhere between fair and good. I am polite on the whole. I do not, on the whole, advertise. I should very much like one of your sandwiches if you have a spare, although I have already had 2 of Ron's. He stopped. Hermione Granger, in the doorway of the compartment, with the wand in her hand and the great deal of brown hair, did not for a long second say anything at all. Her face went through several small precise movements that suggested she was reorganizing several internal filing cabinets. The reorganizing took, on her face, perhaps 3 seconds. The filing cabinets had, on the whole, been generously labeled to begin with, and they accommodated the new information with the small distinct sound of an excellent system absorbing data it had not anticipated. She said. She paused. I haven't a sandwich. My parents thought I should buy something on the train. Are you joking? About which part? Any of it. None, I see, said Hermione, who in fact did not see and was not, by long honest practice, going to pretend to. She came in. She sat uninvited on the seat next to Ron, who shifted slightly to give her room and then, on observation of Hermione's slightly stiff posture, shifted back. She put her wand away. She put her hands on her knees. She said, tell me about the chess. Harry told her. The trip to Hogwarts had a great many hours left in it, and Harry, who had been told to demonstrate the chess if asked, demonstrated the chess. He produced from his trunk a small folding board that the cook of Elgidnere had thought to pack, and a set of small wooden pieces, not Marcus's set, that was Marcus's and stayed in the hall, and he set up a problem from one of his books, and he walked Hermione through it. Ron, who had been about to take offense at having Hermione in his compartment, found that his offense had been preempted, in a way he could not quite identify, by the simple fact that Harry was, on the whole, treating Hermione with the same respect he was treating Ron. Ron, with the steady fairness of a third son who had developed a long patient instinct about not being made the principal subject, took a chocolate frog and went back to his cards. The countryside became wilder as they went north. The trees grew taller and the rivers faster, and by the time it began to dim outside the windows, the train was running through a long valley with hills on either side. Hermione, who had not on first acquaintance struck Ron as the sort of girl who could shut up, had with Harry found the trick of asking shorter questions and getting, in return, longer and more interesting answers. She had, on the whole, asked Harry about a dozen things. She had been told, on the whole, the answers in the small, precise voice of a respectable boy who had been raised to answer truthfully. She had stopped on the 3rd question, looking at Ron for affirmation. She had stopped on the 5th question, looking at Harry's forehead. She had begun on the 7th question to ask the question first and to consider it second, which was a very rare procedure for Hermione Granger, and which she had in the moment been only half aware she was attempting. Hermione, said Ron eventually, we are about to arrive. I should put on my robes. Oh, said Hermione, with the small surprise of a girl who had not, in her absorption, looked at the time. Oh. Yes, she got up. I'll be next door. She went. The compartment door slid shut behind her. Ron, who had been about to put on his robes, looked at Harry. You're a very strange person, Harry Potter. I have, said Harry, with the steady acceptance of a boy who had been told this in his hall by people more qualified to judge, been told. The train arrived at Hogsmeade Station in the dark. The dark was a cleaner dark than London's dark. There were stars. There was a half-moon. There was a broad lake at the bottom of a slope and a castle on the far side, and the castle had so many lit windows that on first sight it looked less like a building and more like a small constellation that had decided for the night to settle on a hill. "Fur's years," called a voice out of the night. "Fur's years this way." The voice was a vast voice. It belonged to a man who was, by the small measure of any door he passed under, a great deal too tall for ordinary doorways, and who had on his great face a beard that was, to Harry's careful estimation, larger than several of the dead children of Elgidnir. The man was carrying a lantern. The lantern looked in his hand as a candle would have looked in a lesser hand. "Hagrid," said Ron, who had been told about Hagrid. "He's the gamekeeper." Harry looked at Hagrid. Hagrid was, by his face, a man who had spent the 11 years since the cottage at Godric's Hollow doing his job and not asking any of the questions that had no answers. He had not, by the long old practice of those who carried on, been a happy man for those 11 years. He had been on the whole a good man doing his work. He saw Harry. He saw Harry's face. He stopped for a half-second with the lantern. "Harry," he said. He did not, on the whole, lower his voice. "Mr. Hagrid, your mum. I have been told about her, sir. Your dad. And him, sir. I have been told most of what is to be told, sir. I should be glad if you would not. Tonight is, on the whole, a long night, and I am 11. Hagrid looked at him. Hagrid's great face in the lantern light did several things in series, none of which were broad enough to be called expressions if one had been 100 yards off, but all of which were, to a child who had been raised among shades, plain enough. Hagrid, in the small final movement of the series, settled on the small grave nod of a man who had been told something kindly by a child who had had no business being kind at the moment. "Right you are, Harry," he said. "Right you are. Come along then. Boats." They went down to the lake. The boats were small and old and rocked gently. Harry, with Ron and Hermione and the round-faced boy with the recovered toad, got into one. The boats went, by some quiet old working, across the lake without anyone rowing. The castle grew larger as they approached. The lit windows became, on the rise, distinct windows, and the windows became, on the close approach, lit rooms, and the rooms had in some of them figures moving, and the figures, in their slow moving, were preparing the great hall above for the arrivals. They came to the gate. They climbed up. They stood in a great press of small first-years, in a chamber off the hall, while a tall stern witch in green robes addressed them. The witch's name, by her own announcement, was Professor McGonagall, and she had by her face a face that Harry recognized. He had not seen the face. He had been told by his ward mother, in the long quiet way she had told him a number of things, that the face had, on the night of his arrival, watched a Surrey Lane all day in the shape of a tabby cat. He had been told also that he might, by the small private courtesy of a child who had been told a thing about an adult, give the adult a small sign that he knew. He had been told also that he might just as well not. He did not. He had decided on the way up the slope that he would not. He had been in his first encounter with mortal Britain on the whole restrained, and he intended on his second encounter to keep being restrained. The teacher could find out at her own pace. She gave them a brief speech about the 4 houses. She left them with the instruction to wait in the chamber while the hall was prepared. She returned. She led them in. The great hall was, by any first encounter, a sight. The ceiling, by an old working, showed the night sky overhead. The tables were set. The candles, hanging in midair, hung. The 4 long tables had the older students at them, in robes with their house colors, and the older students all turned to look at the line of first-years. Harry, who had been raised in a hall where one was looked at as a small ritual the thing might not survive, was looked at by a great many older students, and by several teachers, and by the headmaster at the long high table at the front, and by, in particular, a thin pale man with greasy black hair on the left side of the high table, who saw Harry's face, who saw the small thin line on his forehead, and who, in the small private way of a man who had spent his life noticing things he was not supposed to, went very still. The Sorting Hat sang. The Sorting Hat sang, on the whole, an unimpressive song. The first-years were one by one called to the stool, and the hat was set on their heads, and the hat called out a house, and the first-year went, with relief or with disappointment, to the table they had been sent to. Hermione Granger went to Gryffindor on the 3rd syllable. Ron Weasley went to Gryffindor on the 4th. The round-faced boy whose toad had been found went to Gryffindor on the 7th. Several first-years went to Hufflepuff and several to Ravenclaw, and a small chilly procession went to Slytherin. Potter Harry, the hall on the calling, went silent. The silence was, on the whole, the silence of a hall that had spent 10 years telling stories about a name and was now, finally, looking at the name in the flesh. The silence was, in Harry's careful estimation, comparable in kind to the silence of the leaky cauldron a month before. He stepped out of the line. He walked to the stool. He did not, on the whole, hurry. He sat, Professor McGonagall set the hat on his head. The hat slid down a little over his eyes. The hat said in its small interior voice, "Well, well, well." Harry did not, by long careful practice, react to the words. "What have we here?" said the hat. "A child of mortals raised by a queen. A child of mortals with a piece of an old enemy in his head, except, well, that has been seen to, has it not? A child with the bearing of a wraith-walker and the patience of a chess player. A child whose ward mother is, by my long old reading of small old workings, a daughter of Loki Lofajarson, queen of 9 kindly hells." Said Harry, in his interior voice, in the small, careful way the cook had taught him to speak in the rare times he had to speak in his head. "I have not had," said the hat, "a child of this kind. I have in my long reading had children of every house, and children of mixed houses, and children of difficult houses, and children of no house at all. I have not on the whole had a child of Elgidnir. I am on the count of the hall of Elgidnir. I know, I am reading thee. Read on." The hat read. The hat read for a measurable time. The hat on the whole was an old and patient hat who had been sorting since before any of the present teachers had been born, and it had developed over centuries the small distinct dignity of a tool that took its work seriously. It read. It rummaged in its interior pocket of sorting criteria. It put down in its considerations several different houses and picked them up again and put them down again. The hall waited. A minute passed, 2 minutes, 3. McGonagall by the stool glanced at the headmaster. The headmaster looked at the hat. The headmaster's twinkle was at the moment dampened. The headmaster had been waiting for 10 years to see his lost and found pupil placed at a table, and he had not on the whole expected the placing to take 3 minutes. The hat in Harry's head made a small sound that was the hat's sound for clearing its throat. "I shall," it said, "place thee in Slytherin, with qualifications." "What are the qualifications?" "I am to advise thee that thou art, on consideration, not a Slytherin in the way the Slytherin house has come to understand the word. Thou art a Slytherin of the older sort, the kind that took the long view, the kind that played the long game, the kind that did not advertise. The current Slytherin house is a faction within a faction. Thou art not on inspection of that faction. Thou shalt be in Slytherin nonetheless because thou hast, on inspection, the temperament for the long quiet game, but thou shalt also, on inspection, be of less use to the faction than the faction may, on the whole, hope. This is, in sorting terms, the closest fit available. I am not, on the whole, perfectly happy with it. Thou shalt, however, do well, be at peace." "Yes, hat." "Also," said the hat, with a small dry interior amusement, "give thy regards to thy ward mother. I have had a long old correspondence with her at 1 or 2 removes. I shall." The hat then in its outer voice called, "Slytherin." The hall, which had been holding its breath in a long careful posture, exhaled. The Slytherin table, which had not been entirely sure how to greet the calling, applauded politely. The politeness was, on the whole, a politeness of confusion. Harry got up and walked to the table and sat in the empty seat at the end. He did not, on the whole, look around. He did look once at the staff table. The thin pale man with the greasy black hair was looking at him. The thin pale man had not, in the 3 minutes of the sorting, blinked. The thin pale man did not, on the meeting of eyes, change his expression. The thin pale man inclined his head, the smallest possible inclination, the inclination one professional man of watching gives to another. Harry, by long practice, returned the inclination at the same magnitude. The headmaster looked at him. The headmaster's twinkle was, on the whole, dampened. The headmaster did not, by his slight movement, smile in the way he had been preparing to smile. The headmaster had, on the whole, been making a number of plans about a boy he did not know, and he had, in the past minute, become aware that the plans needed to be revised, and he had, by his considerable practice, begun the revising. The sorting went on. The feast began. The feast was, on the whole, a great deal of food. Harry, who had been raised on the slow, careful cooking of Elgidnir, ate small portions of many things. He sat at the end of the Slytherin table, with no one quite next to him. The Slytherins had, on the whole, not yet decided how to talk to him, and he had, on the whole, not invited them to, because he had been raised to allow people their own pace. When the feast was over and the prefects led the new Slytherins down to the dungeons were not, on close inspection, quite as cold as Helheim, although they were in their own mortal way doing their best. Harry was given a bed in a long room with stone walls and 4 other first-year boys. He was given a small table with a candlestick. He was, by the prefect's small respectful instruction, allowed to settle in. He settled. He did not, on the whole, unpack his trunk all the way. He had been raised in a hall where one did not unpack all the way, on the principle that one might be moving at any time. He took out from the trunk the small writing set the cook had given him, and he set it on the table, and he sat at the table, and he wrote a letter to his ward mother in the precise formal hand the cook had taught him. "Mother," he wrote, "I have arrived at the school. The boats came across the lake, and the lake had a half-moon on it, and the castle had a great many lit windows, of which I shall describe more in due course. The sorting hat took 3 minutes with me. It has placed me in Slytherin, with qualifications it requested I describe to thee in person on the holidays, and with regards. The headmaster watched me for a long time and was, by the close of the meal, planning. The thin, pale teacher with the greasy black hair recognized me on first look and was, by his small inclination of head, polite. I have met the man named Hagrid of whom thou hast told me, and I was, on his small kindness, also kind to him. I have met 2 children with whom I think I shall be friends. The boy is named Ronald Weasley. The girl is named Hermione Granger. They are both, in different ways, at peace. The platform was loud, and the train smelled of coal, and the school is loud, but it is, on the whole, manageable, and I have a bed, and I have begun my unpacking. I hope thou art well. I am, with respect, thy ward, Harry." He folded the letter. He sealed it with a small disk of frost the cook had given him for the purpose. He set it aside. It would go in the morning by Hedwig, who had been delivered to the owlery by the prefect on his way down the corridor. He undressed. He went to bed. The bed in the dungeon had a sheet that was only slightly damp, and a blanket that was, on the whole, warmer than the cradle had been, and a pillow that was, on the whole, somewhat lumpier than the cradle had been. But he had been raised in a hall where one made do, and he made do, and he slept the slow, steady sleep of a child who had been raised by a queen who had taught him to sleep on schedule. In the headmaster's office, far up at the top of one of the towers of the castle, Albus Dumbledore sat for a long time with his hand on his desk and Fawkes on the perch beside him. He did not, on the whole, make a sound. He had been all evening observing. He had observed, on the whole, a boy he had not expected. He had observed, in particular, a boy whose forehead bore a scar so faint that it had barely been there, and whose bearing in the hall had been the bearing of a child who had, at some point in the 11 years since the cottage at Godric's Hollow, been raised in a country he, Albus Dumbledore, had not been able to budget for. He looked at Fawkes. Fawkes looked at him. Fawkes, in the long old way of phoenixes and grandfathers, did not say anything, and Albus Dumbledore, for the second time in 11 years, said, to no one in particular, "Well." In the dungeons, in his bed, the boy slept on. The thread on his wrist, by long old habit, did not, on the whole, fray. The faint, thin line on his forehead, by long old habit, did not, on the whole, breathe. The candle by his bed went out, by quiet old working, at the appointed hour. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. The quiet war term began with a great deal of small business. The first weeks were, on the whole, the small adjustments any school made for a great many children at once. Schedules were distributed. Schedules were misread. The Slytherin first years walked, as a unit, the wrong way down a corridor in the third week and were corrected by a portrait that took, on the whole, considerable pleasure in its correcting. The Gryffindor first years did the same down the same corridor, on the same morning in the opposite direction, and were corrected by the same portrait, which had the particular advantage of facing both ways. The teachers, in their small, careful old practice, did not comment. Harry took his lessons. He took them with the steady patience he gave to most things. He had been raised in a hall where one paid attention to the teacher, because the teacher had, on the whole, taken trouble to be ready for one, and he applied this to mortal teachers without modification. He sat at the front of his classes when the seating allowed it. He took notes. He read the chapters in advance. He did the exercises slowly and correctly. He raised his hand only when he had a question that he could not work out in his own head, which was, in most subjects, less often than the teachers were used to. His friends were Hermione Granger, who had the quick mind and the citations, and Ron Weasley, who had the steady fairness and the food. Hermione and Ron were in Gryffindor, and he was in Slytherin. This had been considered, by most of the first years and several of the older students, a small obstacle. Harry, who had been raised in a hall where the inhabitants were divided into 8 categories and friendships ran in patient lines across all of them, did not consider it an obstacle. He met them in the library on Tuesday and Thursday after dinner, and they did their homework together at a long table by the window, and the librarian, who had heard a number of small, careful old workings rumored about the boy, did not, on the whole, hurry them out at closing. The Slytherins, on whom Harry's strangeness had been judged at first sight to be a disqualification, came around in a slow, staggered way as the term went on. They did not, in the first month, befriend him. They did, in the second month, stop walking around him in the corridor, which was a small Slytherin advance toward acquaintance. They did in the third month decide that the small first-year boy with the precise nodding and the slow, steady chess and the strange ward mother was, in his way, a credit to the table, and several of them began to nod to him at meals, and a few of them, by the fourth month, would sit beside him. His prefect was a fifth-year named Gemma Farley, who had been told, by means none of the first years had been privy to keep an eye on him. She had taken the keeping of the eye seriously. She had not been intrusive. She had simply been in the dungeon and at the table and in the long corridors of Slytherin's residential level, present in a small, reliable old way, and had answered such questions as Harry had brought her, and had introduced him by name to the Slytherin house ghost, who was the Bloody Baron, and who, on Harry's quiet, courteous nod, had given him in return the slightly less bloody nod of a ghost who had been told a very interesting thing about a small new student and had decided to reserve judgment for a few centuries before doing anything about it. Harry did not, on the whole, encounter Quirinus Quirrell in the first weeks except in his classroom. Quirrell taught defense against the dark arts. Quirrell taught it badly. Quirrell taught it badly because Quirrell had been, on the whole, possessed for the past year by a man who did not, by his own self-account, want anyone in the class to learn anything useful. The defense classroom smelled of garlic and old turban. Quirrell stuttered. Quirrell did not, on the whole, look at his students. He looked at the floor or at the ceiling, or, in the rare moments of bravery, at the door. He looked, in particular, never at Harry. He did not look at Harry, because the man behind the man could not bear to. The man behind the man had, on Harry's first walking past Quirrell on the first day of term, gone very quiet inside the back of Quirrell's head and had stayed quiet for the rest of the class. The man behind the man did not, on the whole, like quiet. He had been a great deal louder in his life, and he had made several small, careful arrangements over the past decade to ensure that his quiet phases were short and his loud phases long. He found that in Harry's presence he was quiet whether he wished to be or not. He did not, by long stubborn old habit, wish to be. He was quiet anyway. The cold absence at the back of his small old anchor in the boy was, on every encounter, slightly larger. The cold absence had, by the third week, eaten what was left of his small old anchor, and the cold absence had begun in the fourth week to draw very slowly on the man behind the man himself. He did not realize this. He believed he was being patient. He believed he was watching, and that the watching in due course would yield him an opening. He had been a long time at his work. He had, on the whole, been confident in his confidence. Harry did not, in the first months, advertise his attention to Quirrell. He sat in the back of the classroom. He took his notes. He answered questions when called on, in a small, precise voice. He looked when looking at the door, the floor, the windows, the front of the room. He looked when Quirrell turned away at the back of the turban, and he looked when the man behind the man could be felt to be paying attention at his notes. He had been raised by a queen who had taught him not to look at the predator and not to be visible to the predator until one had decided what to do about the predator, and Harry, who had not yet decided what to do about the predator, was content, on the whole, to watch. The man behind the man came, by the sixth week, to suspect that the boy was watching him. The suspicion was a small, slow suspicion. He could not, in any of the watchings, find evidence that the boy was watching him. The boy looked at the right places, said the right things, did not single him out. The suspicion grew anyway. He had not, on the whole, kept his confidence in confidence by ignoring suspicions. He decided in the seventh week to test. He had Quirrell try, with the small, sad smile of a man assigning extra work, a particular question to Harry in class. The question was harder than the other questions. The question required a piece of theory that the textbook had not covered, but that any child of the wizarding houses might have heard from his parents. The man behind the man had selected the question deliberately. The man behind the man wanted to see the boy stumble. The man behind the man wanted, on the boy's stumbling, to feel the small private satisfaction of a hidden enemy who had got the upper hand on his target without the target knowing. Harry answered the question. He answered it correctly. He answered it without elaborating. He had read, over the summer, a great deal that the textbook had not covered, and he had been raised by an uncle who had told him, on the whole, the long old workings of mortal Britain over slow dimmings in the great hall. He gave the textbook answer plus the long old answer, in 2 sentences, and he sat down. The man behind the man went very quiet. Quirrell, who had not, on the whole, expected the answer, mumbled something about good and went on with the lesson. After class, Harry stayed in his seat for a moment before going to the next class. He did not, on the whole, do this. He had been, for 7 weeks, the first to leave when the bell rang. He stayed in his seat now, putting his books slowly into his bag. Quirrell at the front, who had been clearing the board, glanced at him once and looked away and went back to clearing. "Professor," said Harry in a small, precise voice. "Yes, Mr. Potter. My uncle has asked me to give you his regards." Quirrell at the front of the room paused with the chalk in his hand. The pause was a small pause. The man behind the man, who had been in the previous half hour very quiet, came on the words, very fully awake. Why, your uncle, Mr. Potter." "My uncle, sir. He had hoped to call on you in person, but he is, on the whole, busy in other countries this term. He said also, sir, that he wishes you a pleasant year. That is all, sir. I shall not keep you." Harry got up and shouldered his bag and walked out. He did not look at Quirrell. He did not look at the back of the turban. He walked, in the small, precise pace he had been raised to, down the corridor to his next class. The man behind the man in the back of Quirrell's head was by then in a state that, for a man without a body, came as close to fury as could be managed. He had recognized the small, careful turn of phrase. He had recognized, in particular, the small, careful regards. He had, by the end of the corridor on which Quirrell stumbled twice, reasoned his way, slowly and badly, to the only available conclusion. The boy knew. The boy had known, at the leaky cauldron, that the man behind the man was in the back of Quirrell's head. The boy had known, on every passing in the corridor, that the man behind the man was riding Quirrell. And the boy had, on this particular morning, sent his uncle's regards by way of a small, precise greeting that contained, in its careful etiquette, the small, clear notice that the boy knew, that the boy's uncle knew, that the boy's ward mother knew, and that the boy, in spite of all of this, was choosing, on the whole, to be polite. The man behind the man did not know what to do with this. The man behind the man had, by long old habit, dealt with enemies by either killing them or making them serve him. He had not dealt with an enemy, in his long old career, by being politely greeted by them in a small, empty classroom. He did not, on the whole, recover from the politeness. The politeness, in the weeks that followed, ate at him in small, careful ways. He found by the 9th week that he had begun avoiding the corridor between his classroom and the staff room because the corridor had a chance of containing the boy. He found by the 10th week that he had begun, against his will, considering whether to abandon the present body and find another one. He did not abandon. He was in his own way stubborn. He stayed. Harry, on his side, did not, on the whole, push. He did, however, encounter the thin, pale teacher with the greasy black hair who taught potions, who was Severus Snape. Snape did not, on the whole, look like a happy man. He looked like a man who had accumulated, over a long life, a great many small grievances, who had filed each of them carefully, who had kept them in a long, quiet ledger, and who had, in the slow, private practice of a man without other consolations, reread the ledger most evenings. He took the first Slytherin potions class on Friday morning. The class was held in a long room in the dungeons. The benches were old. The cauldrons were old. The light was, by old working, slightly green. Snape entered. He took up his place at the front. He surveyed the class with a single, slow, precise look, and his eyes, on the survey, paused on Harry for the smallest fraction of a second. He started the class. He started it with the speech he always started Slytherin first years with, which was a speech he had been giving with small variations for 10 years, and which had not, in those 10 years, lost any of its quiet edge. He spoke slowly. He did not raise his voice. He used, in his speech, a vocabulary that was 3 steps above what a first year was supposed to know. He paused between his sentences, the small, precise pause that gave the students, on the whole, the impression that he was leaving room for them to interrupt and would not, on the whole, take it kindly if they did. Harry sat in the front row. He listened. He took notes in the small, precise hand the cook had taught him. At the end of the speech, Snape said, in the carrying voice he kept for the small, careful demonstration of authority, "Potter, sir, our new celebrity." He had been working on the inflection of celebrity for some time. The inflection was, on the whole, refined. Harry did not, on the inflection, react. He did not, on the whole, react to inflections. The cook's inflections had, in his early years, been in the long old tongue, and they had carried more freight than Snape's, and he had, in those years, learned to listen for the freight rather than for the inflection. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? You would get, sir, a sleeping draught known as the draught of living death, made stronger or weaker depending on quantity. The cook of my hall has a similar recipe in her ledger. She does not, on the whole, use it on living guests. A pause. Where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar? In the stomach of a goat, sir, or in the apothecary on Diagon Alley. A bezoar is a stone that has formed in the stomach. It will save you from most ordinary poisons. What is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane? They are the same plant, sir, also known as aconite. It is a flowering plant of the buttercup family. It is highly poisonous. It is also useful in certain workings of transformation, which the cook of my hall has on occasion demonstrated to me. A longer pause. You have read the textbook, Mr. Potter. I have, sir. And rather more than the textbook. I have been raised, sir, in a hall whose cook keeps a working ledger. I have read it. I have read several other ledgers. I see. The pause that followed was, by the small private estimation of the older Slytherins in the room, the longest pause Severus Snape had given a first year in their experience of him. He looked at Harry. Harry looked back. The thin pale eyes did not, on the whole, change. The greasy black hair did not, on the whole, change. The mouth around the corners made a small movement that, on another face, would have been the beginning of a frown turned, in the last second, to the beginning of something else. 5 points to Slytherin, said Snape slowly, for the recognition of source. Open your books to Chapter 1. The class opened books. The class set up cauldrons. The class brewed, with varying degrees of catastrophe, the simple cure for boils. Harry's was, by the end of the lesson, perfectly correct. Snape walked the aisle. He paused at Harry's cauldron. He took a small dipper. He sniffed. He nodded once. He said, "Acceptable, Mr. Potter. 5 more points." He went on. That evening in his office, Severus Snape sat for a long time. He had, in the small private practice of a man who kept ledgers, been keeping a ledger about Harry Potter for 10 years. The ledger had in it every small piece of information he had been able to gather about a boy who had been, by all available accounts, missing. The ledger had been, on the whole, sparse. The ledger had in its margins the small private grievances of a man who had loved a woman a long time ago, and had not in the years since been able to put down the grievance about her son the way the race of Helheim had not in the years since been able to put down their feuds. He took out the ledger. He looked at the pages. He took up the quill. He wrote in the careful, neutral hand he reserved for the entries he could not, in honesty, surround with grievance. The boy is alive. The boy has been raised. The boy has been raised by someone with sense and considerable resources. The piece of his old enemy on his forehead is, by my close inspection at the feast, no longer a piece of his old enemy. It has been worked on. It has been worked on for years. The work has been thorough. The work has been done by someone whose name is not in my ledger available, but whose patience, by the look of the work, is considerable, and whose kindness, by the bearing of the boy, is considerable also. He is courteous. He answered my questions correctly. He did not, on my naming of him as celebrity, react. He did not, in the corridor afterward, react. He has been raised by someone who has done what I, on the whole, did not believe could be done. I owe my respect. He closed the ledger. He set it down. He sat at his desk for a long time after. He had been, on the whole, planning to dislike the boy, on the principle that the boy was the boy of James Potter, and James Potter had been in his life a particular kind of nuisance. He found on the meeting of the boy that the boy was not, on the whole, a James Potter. The boy was something else. Severus Snape had been, in his life, a quick man at recognizing what kind of something else a thing was, and on the whole he was a man who, having recognized something, did not, in his ledger, fight it. He did not become a friend of the boy that evening. He was not the kind of man who made friends. He did, however, in the small private way of a man revising, decide that the boy was not, in his ledger, going to be filed under James Potter. He decided that the boy was, in his ledger, going to be filed under his own name, on a fresh page, with the small, clean column head of someone he was going to be, on the whole, careful with. This, in the long old practice of Severus Snape, was as close to a kindness as he was, on the whole, prepared to extend. In the following week, in a corridor between the dungeons and the great hall, Snape attempted, in the small, careful old practice of a man trained in the art, a single brief legilimency on Harry. He did it without warning. He did it on a passing glance. As Harry was walking the other way, he caught the boy's eye for a half-second, and reached, in the small, precise way one reached on a legilimency, for the surface of his thought. He met, in the half-second, a hall of bone. The hall of bone was not a memory. The hall of bone was a working. The hall of bone was the small, careful arrangement, by the boy's ward mother and his uncle and his cook and his teachers and the 8 long-dead children of his hall, by which his mind had been, over 11 years of patient old practice, organized. The hall of bone was the boy's interior architecture. The hall of bone had walls that were old. The hall of bone had floors that were old. The hall of bone had, in its main hall, a chair of carved bone with a queen sitting in it, and the queen, on Snape's reaching, looked up and saw him, and gave him the smallest possible inclination of head, and went back to her ledger. Snape withdrew. He withdrew in the small, precise way of a man who had attempted a working that he had not been prepared for, and who recognized, on first contact, that the working was very old indeed and was being managed, on the other side, by a queen with whom he was not going to argue. He kept walking. He did not, on the whole, react. Harry, who had felt the reach in the small private place where he felt such reaches, did not turn his head. He kept walking. He did not, on the whole, react either. He had been raised by the queen who lived in his interior chair to allow people their own pace. Snape, in his office that evening, added a single line to the boys' column in the ledger. The line was, "He is, in the matter of his mind, very thoroughly attended to. I shall not attempt that again." Quirrell, who had been told by the man behind the man to attempt the same kind of reach, attempted it on a Friday morning in the corridor outside the defense classroom. Quirrell did not have Snape's skill. Quirrell on the reach met the same hall of bone, and the same queen, and the same small inclination of head, and was thrown out so hard that he stumbled into a doorway and bruised his elbow. The man behind the man in the back of Quirrell's head on the experience made a small noise that in a body of his own would have been a scream. Harry, from down the corridor, did not turn his head. He kept walking. He had, in the small private place where he felt such reaches, felt this one too, and had recognized it as the same kind of reach as Snape's, and had let his ward mother manage it, and was, on the whole, grateful for her management. He continued to his next class. By Halloween, Harry had been at Hogwarts 7 weeks. Halloween at the school was, by old practice, a feast. The hall was decorated with carved pumpkins, and the candles overhead had been replaced with small floating pumpkin lanterns, and the platters on the tables had been, by old kitchen working, increased in size by a quarter. The students had, on the whole, dressed up, some of the older students in costumes that had taken weeks to prepare, some of the first years in small, unconvincing improvisations of bedsheet and ribbon. The hall had a small festive sound to it. Harry, who had been raised in a country where the 10th month was a remembered and slightly cool month, sat at the Slytherin table. He ate slowly. He did not, on the whole, decorate. He had been all morning very quiet inside himself because he had been told, in his ward mother's last letter, that he should be quiet inside himself on the night of Halloween, because the night of Halloween in mortal Britain was the night his mortal mother had died, and the Queen had advised him to be quiet inside himself in honor of her, and to think of her on the small private place where he kept her, and not, on the whole, to perform his quietness. He had taken the advice. In the middle of the feast, the doors of the great hall flew open. Quirrell came running in, the turban askew, his arms flailing. "Troll," he said, "in the dungeons, thought you ought to know." He fainted. The hall, after a half-second, erupted. The headmaster, by old practice, organized the hall. The students were dismissed by house. The Slytherins were sent to a different dormitory, on the principle that their own dormitory was in the dungeon, and the troll, by Quirrell's report, was also in the dungeon. The prefects led their houses out. Hermione Granger had not been at the feast. This had not been remarked on by any of the teachers. It had been remarked on by Ron Weasley, in the small, worried way of a boy who had not, in the previous fortnight, been kind enough to Hermione, and who suspected she had spent the afternoon crying in the girls' bathroom on the second floor. He caught Harry's sleeve as the houses were being lined up, and he said quickly, low, "Hermione's in the bathroom on the second floor, Harry. She doesn't know. We've got to—" "Yes," said Harry. They slipped, in the press of small first years, out of the line, and they went down the long corridor toward the second floor. Halfway there, the smell hit them. The smell was not a smell of mortal cooking. It was the smell of a thing that had been, in its life, sleeping in a bog and was, on this evening, awake. They turned the corner. The troll was at the door of the bathroom. The troll had a club. The troll was, by the slow, distant intelligence in its small eyes, in a very poor mood. The troll was the second most surprising thing Harry had encountered in mortal Britain. The first had been the leaky cauldron's fading green. The troll was, in his careful estimation, exactly the size of one of the larger of the dead in the lower quarter of Helheim, who had been, in life, a particularly thick-browed soldier of an obscure kingdom, and the dead soldier had, in Dimming's past, sat on a low stool by the brazier and told stories. Harry had, on the whole, liked the dead soldier. This troll was alive. Living trolls, by his teacher's accounts and his uncle's, were not, on the whole, sat by braziers material. Living trolls were closer to the wraiths. "Ron," said Harry in a small, clear voice, "stay back, speak no spells. Wait, Harry, wait." He stepped forward. He did not, on the whole, raise his wand. He had, in the 11 years of his life, learned the small, careful old practice of moving, so that a thing did not, on first sight, register one. He moved. The troll, which had been about to swing its club into the bathroom door, paused. The troll's small eyes flickered. The troll's nose lifted, the way the noses of large, slow things lifted when they smelled a thing they had not expected. Harry, in his small, careful voice, said the small word for hush in the long old tongue, and put it by the voice throwing into a stone in the wall behind the troll. The troll turned. The troll looked slow at the wall. The wall did not, by the small, careful old working, repeat the word. The word had been a one-time word. The troll, having looked at the wall, did not see the word. Harry, while the troll was looking at the wall, walked forward and reached up and laid his palm flat on the troll's left foot. The troll's foot was as big as a chair. The palm was the size of a saucer. He said in the long old tongue, very quietly, the second small word he had ever been taught, which was the small word for sit. He had, in his life, used the small word for sit on a number of things. He had used it on Marcus's chess knight when the knight, by means of an old working, had decided to wander. He had used it on the wraith of an old goose that had, in its decade, taken to drifting in the rafters of the great hall. He had used it on the cook's smaller kettle, which had, in a particular dimming, decided to walk. The small word for sit was a small word. The small word for sit was not, by ordinary measure, very useful. It worked on the whole on stupid things. The troll sat. It sat with a great soft thump that made a small earthquake in the corridor. The troll's club fell. The troll looked slow around the corridor. The troll looked in a small worried way at its own legs, on which it had not, by its own decision, sat. The troll did not understand why the legs had folded. The troll, on the whole, was not bright enough to make any of the available inferences. Harry, with the troll seated, walked past it, picked up the club, which, by his own old practice, was no heavier in his hand than a chess piece because he had been raised in a country where heaviness obeyed different rules, and because the club did not, on the whole, know him well enough to disagree, set the club on the ground at a polite distance and knocked on the bathroom door. Hermione. Harry. Open the door. She opened it. She had been crying. She looked at him, and she looked past him at the seated troll, and her eyes did the small, precise widening of a girl who had read a great deal of background reading and had not in any of her reading been prepared for a seated troll in a corridor. Ron, behind Harry, was, by his face, in a state of considerable awe. Come on, said Harry. It will get up in 3 or 4 minutes. We should be elsewhere. They went elsewhere. Professor McGonagall found them in a stone alcove around the corner. She had a wand in her hand and the small, precise expression of a woman who had spent 20 minutes hunting a troll and had, on the hunting, accumulated a certain amount of feeling. Snape was behind her. Quirrell was behind Snape, having, by the small revealing in the entrance hall, recovered from his faint and being, on the whole, wishing he had not. What, said McGonagall, are you three doing here? Hermione, in a small, careful voice that surprised both Harry and Ron, said, It was my fault, Professor. I went looking for the troll. I'd read about them and I thought I could handle it. The boys came after me. Harry sat the troll down. Sat the troll down. Yes, Professor. McGonagall looked at Hermione for a long second. McGonagall looked at Harry. Harry, in the small, precise voice he had been raised to use, said, I asked it to sit, Professor, in the long old tongue. The troll sat. The troll is by now possibly standing again. The long old tongue. Yes, Professor. I see, said Professor McGonagall. She did not by her face see. She had been, on the whole, prepared to deduct house points. She had been, on the whole, prepared to give a long, small lecture. She found, on Harry's small, precise voice, that she had no further questions of any of them on the matter of the troll, and that she had, on the whole, several questions of several other people. 5 points to Gryffindor for not panicking. 5 points to Slytherin for the long old tongue. Severus, kindly find the troll. Quirinus, kindly assist him. Mr. Potter, walk with me. Snape and Quirrell went off down the corridor. Hermione and Ron, with great backward glances, were sent up to their dormitories. Harry walked, with Professor McGonagall, in the small, precise pace they shared, down to the headmaster's office. The headmaster received him in the small, careful manner of a man who had been waiting for an occasion. The headmaster offered him a seat. The headmaster offered him also a small dish of lemon drops, which Harry, who had been raised on slow cooking, accepted one of on principle and did not eat. Mr. Potter, said Albus Dumbledore, tell me about the long old tongue. Harry told him. Harry told him in the small, precise voice he had been raised to use, in the careful order he had been taught to give such information. He gave the headmaster the basics. He did not, on the whole, give him the cook's name. He did not give him the 8 children's names. He gave him, in particular, the ward mother's name, because the ward mother had told him, in her last letter, that he might. The headmaster listened. The headmaster did not, on the listening, interrupt. The headmaster's hands lay folded on his desk, and he looked on the whole at the desk and not at Harry. The headmaster's eyes, when they came up, were dampened. I see, said Albus Dumbledore. Mr. Potter, may I ask, how well do you keep in your hall the small old courtesies? As well, sir, as a child of 11 can. I have been told for 10 years the courtesies. I have been required for 10 years to practice them. I have in 11 years broken 3 of them. I am, on the whole, learning. You have a fine ward mother. I have. I had not, on the whole, anticipated your ward mother. She is not, on the whole, a woman one anticipates. Dumbledore's mouth did the smallest movement. The movement was not a smile. The movement was, in its way, the close cousin of a smile. Mr. Potter, he said, I should like to invite you for tea on Sunday afternoons in this term at 4. I believe we have a great deal to talk about. I should be glad, sir. Excellent. Now off you go. Madame Pomfrey will want to make sure you have not been bruised by the troll, who was, on her staff list, a class III dangerous creature. Sir, the troll was not bruised by me either. It is, on the whole, well. That is a credit to you, Mr. Potter. He went. He went to Madame Pomfrey, and he was checked, and he was sent to bed. He wrote his ward mother a letter that night in the precise formal hand. He wrote, Mother, there was a troll. I have sat it down in the long old tongue. Hermione is well. Ron is well. The headmaster has invited me for tea. He sealed it. He went to bed. In the corridor outside the Great Hall, much later that night, Hermione Granger walked back to her dormitory in the company of Ron Weasley, and she said, I don't on the whole understand him. No, said Ron, me neither. I think I should like to. Me too. Then we shall. Yes, said Ron. They went. By December, the headmaster's tea had become a small Sunday institution. They sat in the high office at the top of the tower, and the headmaster poured tea from a pot that was, by old working, always full, and they spoke. They spoke of Harry's hall, his teachers, the long old courtesies. The headmaster asked. Harry answered. Neither pushed, neither withheld. In one of the conversations, Dumbledore asked, in the small, careful voice he kept for such questions, Mr. Potter. The piece of him that was on your forehead, you have said it has been, in the years of your raising, removed. Yes, sir, removed by your ward mother. Removed by her hall, sir, with her direction. The hall has its own weather, and if he were, on the whole, to encounter you in person, he would, sir, find the place in me where his anchor used to be cold and clean. He would, on the encountering recoil. He would, on his recoil, be, for a brief time, unanchored to the world, and any hold he has on the world would, in that brief time, be very weak indeed. You have thought about this. My uncle has thought about this. I have, on his thinking, been told. Dumbledore looked at him. The headmaster's mouth, around the corners, made the small movement that was, in its way, the close cousin of a smile. Then he said, we are, on the whole, in better positions than I had thought, and considerably better positions than your old enemy has thought himself in. Mr. Potter, I should like to ask one further question. Sir, what does your ward mother wish me to do in the matter of your old enemy? She wishes you, sir, to do nothing in particular. She wishes you to allow him to come at me in his own way in his own time this term. She wishes me to be ready. She has told my uncle to be in the country in late spring, with the small papers of Mr. L. Lyasmith on him, in case. She has told the goblins of the bank to be ready to send a runner to the gate of Elgidnir, in case. She has told the Queen of the Spring Half to be at the Green Half until further notice in case, although she has not specified what the Spring Half should be ready for. She has, for me, a single instruction: do not, on the whole, hurry. Allow him to come. Allow him to see what is left of his anchor. Allow him to do what he will then do. And what will he then do? He will flee, sir. He will flee weakened. He will not, on this occasion, possess Quirrell long after the encounter. He will be, after this term, a quarter of what he was before the cottage. He will not be done. He will be, on the whole, in less of a position to do what he wishes to do than he has been in 11 years. He will need, on the whole, fresh measures. The fresh measures will be slow. The slowness, my ward mother has said, is a thing she can work with. Dumbledore set down his cup. Mr. Potter, he said slowly, your ward mother is, on the whole, an excellent strategist. She is, sir, and you are her child. I am her ward. As you like. He looked at Fawkes. Fawkes looked at him. Fawkes, in the long old way of phoenixes, said nothing, and Dumbledore took, from the small dish on the desk, a lemon drop and looked at it and put it back and said, I shall, on her advice, do nothing in particular. I shall, however, in the small old way of a man who has been overruled, prepare for what your old enemy may, at the end, attempt. Tell me, Mr. Potter, of the mirror you have been, this past week, looking into. I have not, sir, been looking into a mirror. You have. You have been every other night in the disused classroom on the 3rd floor, where I have left a mirror for some small thinking I was doing about another matter. The mirror has been, on the whole, telling you what you wish to see. You have been, on the whole, watching what it has shown you. You have not been, by the look of you, troubled by what you have seen. I should like to ask you what you have seen. Harry looked at him. Harry, who had been raised by a queen who answered questions truthfully, said, I have seen, sir, my hall. I have seen the great hall of Elgidnir, with the chair of bone, and my ward mother in it, and the cook at the door, and the 8 children at their game in the corner, and my uncle on his low stool tying knots, and the brazier lit. I have seen this every night I have looked. I have not, on the whole, been troubled by it. It is, sir, my home. The mirror is showing me what I miss." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Potter," he said, "that is, on the whole, the kindest answer the mirror has given anyone in my acquaintance. It is, sir, a kind mirror by my own account." "It is by yours, sir. I have a question. Ask. What is in the 3rd-floor corridor on the right-hand side, the corridor we have been told not to enter?" Dumbledore paused. Dumbledore's eyes on the pause did several things in series, none of which were broad enough to be remarked on, but all of which were, to a child who had been raised among shades, plain enough. "A trapdoor," he said. "Below the trapdoor, a series of small old workings that I have arranged with the staff against an intrusion. At the bottom, in the deepest place, the mirror you have been looking into, with a small object hidden in it that the man who killed your mortal parents has been, this term, trying to acquire. I had thought the mirror in its hiding place would be safe from him. I have, in the past few weeks, on the strength of your ward mother's letters to me, become less sure. You are expecting him to come for it. I am. You are expecting me, on the whole, to be there when he does. I am, on her advice, expecting you to be there when he does. I shall, sir, be. Yes, Mr. Potter. And the cup of tea, sir." Dumbledore looked at the pot. The pot was, by its old working, full. He poured. He handed the cup to Harry. Harry took it. They drank. The hall, far away in the country it was in, went on. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. The Voldemort problem. By late spring the term had thinned into the long, slow afternoons that mortal Britain reserved for its examinations, and the corridors of the school were full of the small, precise running of children who had not, in any of the previous months, been running in the corridors. Harry took his exams with the steady patience he gave to most things. He did, on the whole, well in them. He did, on the whole, slightly less well than Hermione, who was, by mid-June, in a state of nerve that the small, careful cooking of the Slytherin table was not equipped to manage. But he did, on the whole, slightly better than Ron, who took the exams with the philosophical resignation of a third son who had grown up in a household where exams had been, on the whole, a known seasonal hazard. In the long pause between the last exam and the closing feast, the school went, by old practice, slightly quiet. Harry, on the 3rd evening of the pause, was at the 4th-floor library when a small note arrived in his hand. The note arrived in the way notes arrived in this school, which was to say, without a deliverer. It appeared on the table by his elbow, by some slow old working that the library staff did not, on the whole, admit to. The note was folded once. The hand was the hand of his ward mother. He had not, in his memory, received a note in his ward mother's hand at the school. The previous letters had come by Hedwig, in the small parcels of the regular post. This one had not. He looked at the folded paper a long second. He picked it up. The note read in 3 lines, "Tonight, be at the 3rd floor. He is going for the mirror. Thy uncle is at the Hogsmeade station and is on his way. Thou knowest what to do." He read it. He did not, on the whole, react. He set the note down. He folded it again. He put it in the inside pocket of his school robe. He looked for a half-second at the other students in the library and at Madame Pince at her desk and at the fading evening through the high windows. He stood up. He gathered his things. He did not, on the whole, hurry. He went down to the Slytherin dungeon and put his bag on his bed and took, from the trunk, the wand of holly and phoenix feather and the school cloak with the runes embroidered in white silk thread in the seam, and the small flat stone with the green vein that Hades had given him on his 9th birthday, and the small leather sack of cord that Loki had given him, and the small folded letter of his ward mother, all of which he distributed, slow, in the various inner pockets of the cloak. He went up. He did not, on the way up, encounter anyone. The corridors were, on the whole, empty. He passed 2 ghosts who nodded to him, the small Slytherin baron and the long courteous friar, and he nodded to them in return, in the long old courtesy he had been raised to. He passed a portrait of an old wizard who had once been a brewer, who looked up from his small painted ledger and said, "Off on a piece of business, young Mr. Potter. On a piece of business, sir. Be well." "I shall." He went up the 3rd-floor corridor on the right-hand side. The door at the end of the corridor was the door he had been told, on the first night of the term, not to go through. He went through it. The room behind the door was small. The room had a great soft sleeping dog with 3 heads in it. The dog's 3 heads on his entry did the small slow turning of 3 heads on a single body that had not, in many months, been turned to a stranger. The dog had, by old working, been the school's first line of defense for the trapdoor under the dog. The dog was, on the whole, a defense for those who had not been raised on Cerberus stories by their uncle. Harry, who had been raised on Cerberus stories by his uncle, took, from his cloak, a small wooden recorder Loki had given him in late January with no explanation. He played on the recorder 3 slow lullaby notes. He did not have, on the whole, a great deal of musical training, but he had been taught by Loki the 3 notes that any dog of the underworld in any of the underworlds would recognize as a request for passage. The dog's 3 heads in series looked at him. The eyes blinked. The heads, one by one, set themselves down. The dog, by the 3rd note, was asleep. He stepped over the great pause. He found the trapdoor. He opened it. He looked down. He did not, on the whole, see the bottom. The trapdoor opened on a long shaft that descended, in the held light he had brought with him in a small lantern at his belt, into a soft dark. He sat on the edge. He let his legs hang. He pushed off. He fell. The fall was, by his count, longer than 3 breaths and shorter than 10. He landed in something soft. The something soft was, by close inspection, a great mat of dense vine leaves that had been arranged at the bottom of the shaft for the express purpose of catching whatever fell down it. The vines, on his landing, began the slow, purposeful work of wrapping around him. He did not, on the whole, panic. He had been raised in a hall where small things tried, sometimes, to wrap around one. He felt on the surface of his skin the small, careful old working of the vine, and he applied to it the small, careful old working of his ward mother, which was the old word for be still in the long old tongue, spoken without raising the voice, in the precise way one spoke to creatures that had been raised on stillness. The vines, after a moment, considered the word, and they considered the boy who had spoken it, and they unwound slow and let him stand. He stood. He brushed his cloak. He went on. The next room was a chamber of flying keys. The chamber had in the air of it several hundred keys, all of them flying, only one of which would, on the small old test of correct trying, fit the door at the far end. The room had in the corner a broomstick. The broomstick was, by old working, the school broom intended for the catching. Harry, who had not learned to fly a broom, he had been raised in a hall whose ceilings were too low for it, and had taken the school's flying lessons with the steady patience he gave to most things, and had been, by his own honest account, mediocre at it, looked at the broom. He looked at the keys. He had in his small leather sack of cord, the cord from Loki's stool, which he had been given on his last visit and had been told to keep. He took it out. He did not, on the whole, fly. He tied very carefully the 7th of the 8 knots of small workings, which was the knot of finding something that had been hidden, and he tied it in particular with the loose end of the cord pointed at the door. He held the cord at arm's length. He waited. The cord, by its small old working, gave a small careful tug. The tug pointed, by its tugging, at one of the flying keys. The flying key was a small bent silver one with a damaged wing. The flying key was, by the cord's tugging, the correct one for the door. Harry, who had been raised in a hall where one did not, on the whole, chase, said the small word for sit in the long old tongue, in the small precise way the cook had taught him, and the small bent silver key, which had been a thing made by a working, and which had not in its long old life been spoken to in the long old tongue, listened. The key sat in midair, as much as a flying key could sit. The key drifted, slow, to his outstretched hand. He took it, he used it, he went through. The next room was a chessboard. The chessboard was the size of the room. The pieces were the size of horses. The pieces were enchanted to play. The room was, on the whole, a small old test of strategy. One had to play through a game and check the king, and the pieces would, on a wrong move, be hostile. He did not, on the whole, take the test as an obstacle. He had been playing chess with Marcus 3 Dimmings a week for 6 years. He took the white side. He played. He won in 14 moves, with the loss of 2 pieces, the second knight, which he sacrificed in move 8, and the white-squared bishop, which he sacrificed in move 13. The black king on the check fell on its knees in the small, precise way of a stone king who had been beaten and was, on the whole, philosophical about it. The door at the end opened. The next room was a troll. The troll was already unconscious. Someone had been here before him. He went on. The next room was the riddle of the 7 bottles. The riddle was a small puzzle that required logic. Hermione would have loved it. He read the verse. He worked the puzzle in his head. It took him, on the whole, 4 minutes. The smallest of the bottles had, by the verse, the potion that would let one go forward. He drank it. The potion tasted of cold lemon. He felt on the drinking a small clean cold work its way down his throat, and he stepped through the wall of black flame at the far end of the room, which did not, on his stepping, burn. The last chamber was a wide round room with a mirror in the middle of it. The mirror was the mirror he had been looking into every other night of the term, in the disused classroom on the 3rd floor. The mirror was, on his recognition, the same mirror. The headmaster had not, on the whole, been keeping a different mirror in the chamber. The mirror had been, in the term, moved. He stood at the door of the chamber and looked at the mirror across the floor, and the mirror, on his looking, showed him, as it had every other night, the great hall of Elgidnir. Standing in front of the mirror with his back to Harry was Quirinus Quirrell. The turban was off. Quirrell, without the turban, was a small thin man with a head that was, by close inspection, not entirely smooth. The back of the head had, at the place where a second face had been told for centuries to stay hidden, a second face. The second face was thin and white, and had a look that did not, on the whole, belong on the back of any head. The eyes of the second face were red. The eyes of the second face, on Harry's entering the chamber, opened. "Potter," said the second face, in the small, sibilant voice that had been small and sibilant in a cottage in Godric's Hollow 11 years before, and had been small and sibilant in a forest in Albania for a decade after, and had been, this term, getting smaller still, although it had not, in its own small private estimation, been getting smaller at all. Harry stopped at a polite distance from the mirror. He did not, on the whole, raise his wand. He had been told by his ward mother, in the small precise letter in his pocket, not to begin with the wand. "Sir," said Harry, in the small precise voice he had been raised to use. "Sir," said the second face. The face's mouth made a small, careful movement that was not, on the whole, a smile. "Politeness, the boy is polite. I have been raised to be. By whom? My ward mother. And who is thy ward mother, Potter?" "Hel of Helheim, sir, daughter of Loki Lofajarson, queen of 9 kindly hells." A pause. "That is a great deal of titles, Potter." "It is, sir, she has earned each of them." The second face's eyes did not, on this, blink. The second face, on the whole, was thinking. The man behind the man had been, all term, thinking, and he had been, at every step of his thinking, arriving at conclusions that were further from the conclusions he had been arriving at in the cottage in Godric's Hollow 11 years before. He was, in his small, slow, private way, not pleased. "Look in the mirror, Potter." "Sir." "Look in it." "Sir, why?" "Because I command thee." "Yes, sir." He stepped forward. He did not, on the whole, hurry. He stood beside Quirrell at the mirror. His shoulder was even with Quirrell's elbow because Quirrell was a head taller than him. His eyes were level with the upper third of the mirror's frame. He looked into the mirror. The mirror showed him, as it had every night, the great hall of Elgidnir, the chair of bone, his ward mother in it, the cook at the door, the 8 long-dead children at their game in the corner, the brazier lit, his uncle on his low stool tying knots. It also showed him, on this evening, one new thing. His ward mother was standing. His ward mother was looking in the mirror at the mirror. Harry, in the small private place where he kept her, felt her looking. He did not, on the whole, react. He let his face be the face of a boy who had, on his ward mother's instruction, looked into a mirror that he had been told to look into. "What dost thou see, Potter?" "My hall, sir." "Thy hall." "My hall where I have been raised." "Liar, sir." "Thou seest the stone, Potter. Thou seest the stone in thy reflection's pocket. The stone is the object of my long old work this year. Thou seest it. Tell me where thou seest it." "Sir, I do not see a stone, I see my hall. There is a small flat stone in my actual pocket, which the receiver of many gave me on my 9th birthday, but it is in the cloak's right inner pocket, and the mirror does not, on the whole, show it. The mirror shows me what I miss." "I miss my hall." "Liar," said the second face again, in the small, careful, sibilant voice. "Thou art a liar in the manner of the boy thy father was. Thou liest with the small, careful expression of a child raised to be polite. Thou liest. Tell me what the mirror shows thee." "The mirror shows thee the stone. The stone is mine. Give it to me, Potter." "Sir, I cannot give thee what is not in my hand." "Quirrell," said the second face sharply. "Use him." Quirrell, who had been standing very still, turned. Quirrell, in turning, had the small, puzzled face of a man who had been given an instruction he had been giving himself for 10 years and had not, on the whole, expected to be giving any longer. He raised his wand. He spoke a word. The word was the word that meant restrain in mortal Britain's small, careful old practice. The word in his hand came out hesitant. The word in his hand had not come out cleanly all term, because the man behind the man had been, on the whole, weaker every week, and the wandarm of the man riding on his back had been weaker in concert. Harry, who had been raised by a queen who had taught him to step lightly when restraint was being attempted on him, stepped sideways. The word missed. The word struck the mirror. The mirror, on the striking, did not, on the whole, react. The mirror was, by old working, very nearly unbreakable. The reflection in the mirror of the great hall of Elgidnir did not, on the whole, react either. "Quirrell," said the second face, again. Quirrell tried again. He tried, this time, a word for binding, which was a small word that had been, in his lessons, taught to be used on small things. The word in his hand came out wavery. Harry sidestepped again. The wavery word went past him. "Quirrell," said the second face, "give me the body." Quirrell, on the giving, did the slow, strange thing that men in his condition did, which was to step out of his own face. The thin, small, frightened man went limp. The second face behind took, by an old, slow, careful working that the man behind the man had been preparing for 10 years. the front of the head. Quirrell turned at the door around, and the small, thin, frightened face was now on the back of the head, and the second face was in the front, and the second face raised by Quirrell's hand, Quirrell's wand. It was by the second face's reckoning the moment. The second face had decided in the previous half-minute that politeness was wasted. The second face had decided in the previous half-minute that the boy would not give him the stone. The second face had decided in the previous half-minute that the boy was, on the whole, the same difficulty he had been in the cottage at Godric's Hollow, and that the difficulty was best resolved by the same working that had failed to resolve it 11 years before. He raised the wand. He spoke the word. The word had only ever traveled in one direction in his hand. The word was the word of the killing curse. The word in his hand had killed, in his long old career, more men and women than he had bothered to count. The word came out of the wand. The word traveled across the chamber. It met, at Harry's chest, a wall. The wall was not a wall in the ordinary sense. The wall was, on close inspection, the small, careful, old, patient working of an underworld whose weather had been, for 11 years, slowly and methodically washing the small piece of soul on the boy's forehead. The wall was, on close inspection, the small, clean, cold place in the boy where the anchor had once been. The wall was, on close inspection, Hel of Helheim, who was, in the mirror, looking up. The killing curse did not, on this evening, travel. The killing curse, in fact, did the small reverse thing the killing curse had done in the cottage 11 years before, but quieter. The killing curse, on meeting the wall, slowed. The killing curse stopped. The killing curse, on the stopping, spent itself on the wall in the small, slow, leeching way an unanswerable curse spent itself, and the wall, on the spending, took the curse, and the wall did not, on the whole, register that anything had been spent on it. Harry, who had been told by his wardmother's letter what to expect, did not, on the whole, react. He looked in the mirror at the chair of bone. The queen in the mirror inclined her head, the small, precise inclination he had been giving and receiving all his life, and she lifted her hand, and the small, thin, pale line on his forehead lifted. The thing in the line, which had been a guest in his head for 11 years, gave a small, careful sigh of recognition, and unmoored itself and floated free, and went in the mirror's reflection into the queen's outstretched palm. The queen closed her fingers on it. The thing was, on the closing, gone. The second face screamed. The scream was the scream of a man without a body who has just felt his anchor in the world be removed by a cold hand. The scream was the scream of a man without a body who has just realized that the anchor in the world had been gone, in fact, for some years, and that he had only just noticed, and that the noticing was not, on the whole, the kind of noticing that could be undone. The scream was a thin, sibilant scream that did not, on the whole, register on the small old workings of mortal Britain that registered such things, because the scream was not, by any of the small old measurements, in mortal Britain. The scream went somewhere else. Quirrell, in front of the mirror, fell to the floor. Quirrell's body did in the falling the slow, strange thing that bodies did when their possessing rider had been pulled out faster than the rider had planned to leave. The body did not, on the whole, recover. The body, on the whole, gave out. The man behind the man's exit had been, by his hurry, ungentle. A thin, sibilant column of dark smoke came out of the back of Quirrell's head. The column rose slow in the chamber. The column hovered for a half-second, undecided. The column began, by small old habit, to drift toward Harry. Harry, who had been told by his wardmother to be polite, said in the long old tongue, "Thou hast no anchor here. Thou hast no place here. Thou shalt go. Thou shalt go now." The column shuddered. The column did not, on the whole, want to go. The column had spent 10 years, on the whole, being told it had no place, and it had developed a strong instinct, on the telling, to disagree. The column made a small attempt at disagreement. The attempt was a feeble attempt. The column had, by the unmooring of its anchor, become a great deal smaller than it had been 5 minutes earlier, and a small column had, on the whole, less of a case to make than a large one. Hel of Helheim, in the mirror, said something in the long old tongue that did not have a direct translation. The closest translation was, "Thou wilt go, on this evening, in the direction in which I am pointing, and we will not, on this evening, debate." The column went. The column went up through the chamber's stone ceiling, through the trapdoor, through the roof of the school, into the air over the long, quiet hills of Scotland, and the column drifted off, slow, in the direction the Queen had indicated, which was the direction of the forest in Albania the column had spent 10 years floating in, where it would now, on the whole, have considerably less leverage than it had before it had come on this errand. The chamber was, on the whole, quiet. Harry stood by the mirror. He did not, on the whole, look at Quirrell on the floor. The body of Quirrell had been, in his honest accounting, a small, thin, frightened man who had been, in the last year of his life, possessed against his fairly modest will, and who had not, on the whole, deserved either the possession or the ending. Harry walked, at the small, precise pace he had been raised to, around the body. He knelt. He set his hand on the man's small, frightened forehead. He said, in the long old tongue, a single small word. The word was the small kind word the cook had taught him to say to mortals at the end of their road, which was the word of safe passage. The body did not, on the whole, react. But the small frightened thing in the body, which had been all year in the back of its own head, while another thing had ridden in the front, lifted by the small kind word like a small thin smoke, and the small thin smoke went up through the chamber's ceiling and out and went, by some old courtesy of the long old workings, in a direction that was not the direction the column of dark had gone. It went instead in the direction of a hall it had not been told it was being directed to. The hall was not Elgidnir, the hall was a different hall, somewhere kindly. The small, thin, frightened man would, on the whole, be looked after. Harry stood up. He went to the mirror. He looked at his ward mother in the reflection. She looked at him. She held in her closed fist the small, thin, pale thing that had been, for 11 years, a guest on his forehead. She did not, on the whole, smile. She did, however, incline her head, the small, precise inclination that was, in their long old practice, the equivalent of a smile. "Mother," said Harry in the small, precise voice. "Child, it is done on this evening. It is done. He is a quarter of what he was. He is. He shall on the whole attempt fresh measures. The measures will be slow. We shall manage them. Thou hast done thy part well. Yes, mother. Thy uncle is in the corridor outside the chamber of the dog, child. The dog has been, by his small old practice, set down a second time. The headmaster is on his way by flue with the deputy. Thou shalt sit on the chamber's bench until they arrive. Yes, mother. Thou hast a small flat stone in thy right inner pocket. I have, mother. Take it out. Set it on the floor of the chamber, beside the body of the small, thin, frightened man. Yes, mother. It is the stone the wraith was after. The receiver of many gave it to thee on thy 9th birthday. The stone has been in thy pocket this past year. The actual stone the wraith has been hunting. The school's mirror was, in fact, hiding nothing. The receiver of many wished for thee to be, on this evening, the only stone in the room. The receiver of many is, on the whole, an inveterate strategist. Yes, mother. Take it out, child. He took it out. He looked at the small, flat stone in his palm. The clear green vein in it held the held light gently. He had for 2 years had it in his pocket, and he had, in those 2 years, sometimes turned it in his fingers when he was thinking, and he had grown, on the whole, used to it. Set it on the chamber floor, beside the body of the small, thin, frightened man, with the green vein turned upward. It is set, mother. Then thou shalt go to the bench. Thou shalt be polite to the headmaster. Thou shalt be polite to the deputy. Thou shalt tell them, in the small, precise voice thou hast been raised to use, what has happened in this chamber. Thou shalt not, on the whole, perform thy modesty, nor shalt thou perform thy heroism. Thou shalt be the boy thou hast been all term. Yes, mother. And child, yes, mother. I am on this evening on my way to collect thee. He looked at her in the mirror. In person, mother, in person. The term is at its end by my reckoning, and the headmaster has agreed. I shall be, by the small workings of distance, at the gate of the school in the early morning. Thou shalt come home with me. We shall on the whole have a long quiet summer. Yes, mother. The mirror by old working dimmed. The reflection of the great hall faded slow. The chamber with Harry in it, the body of Quirinus Quirrell, the small flat stone and the slow held light of the lantern, was alone again. Harry, who had been raised to do as he was told, went to the bench. He sat on it. He waited. It took the headmaster, the deputy, and a number of other adults a measurable time to arrive. They came by flue into the disused classroom on the 3rd floor, and they came down through the rooms at the small, precise speed of adults who were very alarmed. The dog had to be set down a 3rd time, since Loki, in the small, precise way of an uncle who had a son of his daughters to look after, had let the dog sit up between his sittings and the adults, so that the adults would have, on the whole, the small impression that they had needed to manage the dog themselves. The chessboard took them an hour. Because none of them was Marcus, the riddle of the 7 bottles took them the small, precise 4 minutes Hermione would have taken, except that Snape had brewed a more efficient one in his sleeve, and they did not have to drink the riddle's potion at all. By the time they came through the wall of black flame into the chamber, Harry was on the bench, with his hands folded on his lap, with the small, precise expression of a boy who had been raised by a queen who had taught him, in particular, what to do with his face when he had been told to wait. The body of Quirrell was on the floor by the mirror. The small, flat stone with the green vein was, on the floor beside him, gleaming softly. "Mr. Potter," said Albus Dumbledore, in the small, careful voice he kept for the larger occasions. "Sir, you are well." "I am, sir. Quirinus Quirrell is, on the whole, less well. The man behind him has gone in the direction of his forest in Albania. He is, by my wardmother's count, a quarter of what he was. The stone is on the floor beside the body with the green vein turned upward. It has been in my right inner pocket for 2 years. Mr. Potter. Yes, sir. You have been, said the headmaster slowly, very well prepared. I have, sir. And the mirror. It showed me, sir, what I miss. It showed me my hall. It showed me, this evening, my ward mother in the mirror looking back at me. The mirror is, on the whole, a kind mirror by my account. It is, by yours. The headmaster knelt by the body. He did not, on the whole, touch it. He looked at the small, flat stone for a long second. He picked it up. He held it in his palm. Looked at the green vein. He set it after a moment in his pocket. The stone is in the school's keeping, he said. Mr. Potter, it shall in due course return to the receiver of many in the long, old, courteous way. He shall by my letter know that you have, on this evening, given the stone over of your own free will. He shall be, on the whole, pleased. Yes, sir. Now, Mr. Potter, there are matters I need to attend to here. I shall ask Professor McGonagall to walk with you to the hospital wing. Madame Pomfrey will want to look you over. Your ward mother has told me, in a small, precise letter delivered an hour ago, that she shall be at the gate of the school in the morning. I shall meet her. Yes, sir. Are you well, Mr. Potter? I am, sir. Then let us walk. Professor McGonagall walked him up to the hospital wing. She did not, on the whole, speak. He did not, on the whole, speak. They walked at the same precise pace. Madame Pomfrey looked him over with the small, efficient old practice of a school nurse. She found, on the whole, very little. She gave him a small cup of warm milk and put him to bed and drew the curtains. He slept. He slept the slow, steady sleep of a child who had been raised by a queen who had taught him to sleep on schedule. In the early morning, Hel of Helheim arrived at the gate of the school. She arrived in the way she arrived in places, which was to say without announcement, and through a door no one had built. The gatekeeper, who in this school was Filch, did not see her arrive. The headmaster, who was waiting by the gate, did. He had been waiting since dawn. He had, by the small, precise old practice of a man who had been overruled, arranged in advance the small, careful welcome a school could offer to a queen of an underworld it had not, on the whole, ever had occasion to receive. The welcome was a folded chair, set out on the lawn by the main door, a small table set beside the chair, a single cup placed on the table, and the headmaster himself in robes of midnight color standing by the chair. Hel of Helheim, on her arrival, paused briefly to look at the lawn. She looked at the chair. She looked at the table. She looked at the cup. She looked at the headmaster. Albus Dumbledore, she said, in the slow, patient voice she had used for centuries. My lady. I have come to collect my ward. He is in the hospital wing, my lady. He is well. I have arranged a chair for you and a cup for you while we wait. That is a courtesy. It is, my lady, the smallest courtesy that I am, on the whole, capable of. She looked at him a long second. The half of her face that was lovely in the morning light was lovely. The half of her face that was bone in the morning light was bone. The long old workings of her two halves, on the whole, did not, by long old practice, surprise the headmaster, who had read, in his life, a great deal of small old workings, and who recognized a queen by the small old workings she had been raised in. She took the chair, she took the cup. The cup was by some old kitchen working of the school, full of warm knot tea, although the school's kitchens did not, on the whole, know how to make warm knot tea. The headmaster had, by long practice, asked his cooks to manage. The cooks had, in their turn, managed. She drank. My lady, said Dumbledore after a moment. Mr. Potter has been a credit to my school this year. He has been, on the whole, the kindest first year I have had the pleasure of teaching in many years. He has done a thing this term that I had not, on the whole, thought possible. He has, by your work, removed a small old evil from the world, in a small clean way, with no mortal blood spilled. I am, my lady, in your debt. Headmaster, said Hel of Helheim, I have not done it. He has done it. I have raised him. You have raised him well, my lady. I have raised him with the help of a household. The household has been patient. The household has been, on the whole, glad of him. I had not, my lady, expected to thank a queen of an underworld this morning. I had expected, on the whole, several other things, and none of them the thanking. I am, on the whole, grateful for the surprise. Headmaster. Thou art a man who has spent a long life expecting things. I suggest, in the small courtesy of my hall to thy school, that thou wert, on the whole, expecting too many things, and not enough surprises. Permit thyself the surprises. They are, in old age, a kindness. He looked at her. He did not, on the whole, react. He set his hand on the table, and he inclined his head, the smallest inclination he had, on the whole, given any visitor in his long life. My lady, headmaster, Mr. Potter shall return next term. He shall return at every term until he is graduated. He shall come home for vacations. He shall visit me at the green half on a yearly cycle. He is, in short, by long agreement, a child of two countries, and shall be raised in both. The thanking is not the thing thou owest me. The thing thou owest me is patience. I shall expect, on the whole, more of it from thee than thou hast been accustomed to giving. You shall have it, my lady. Then we are, on the whole, in agreement. Harry came down the lawn at that moment. He had been told by Madame Pomfrey that he had a visitor. He had walked down, slow, in the school robe with the runes in the seam. He had in the inner pocket the small folded letter from his ward mother, the small leather sack of cord, and the small flat stone the headmaster had returned to him at the door of the hospital wing, with the small precise instruction that he should, on the whole, give it back to the receiver of many in person at his ward mother's solstice visit. He came at the small precise pace he had been raised to across the lawn. He stopped at the chair. He inclined his head. "Mother, child, I am ready. Then we shall go." She rose. She set the cup down. She inclined her head in the small precise inclination to the headmaster. The headmaster inclined his head in return. She set the half hand that was bone on Harry's shoulder and the half hand that was flesh on his other shoulder, and she turned with him, slow, across the lawn. The dead in her hall, on her crossing back through the long corridor and the stairwell and the road and the gate, would, in the way they had not done in years, stand up, and the 8 long-dead children, by the corner where the held light gathered, would, in the small precise way they were learning, set down their game and stand also, and the cook would, by the door of the inner room, have a small honey cake on a small plate, ready in the great hall, by the brazier that had been lit at the beginning of the term and had not, in the term, gone out, would smell of warm knot tea and bone and the slow-fitted stones, and the queen with her ward would walk into the hall through the great door, and the hall would, by old habit, settle around them, and the cold wind that did not, on the whole, blow in this country, would, at the gate, take a small lock of his hair on the way through. In the Hogsmeade station, on the late morning train, Harry's school friends would be on their way south. Hermione would have a list of summer reading. Ron would have, in his trunk, the year's homework and a card from a chocolate frog he had been hoping to find for 2 years. They would, on the platform, have looked in vain for him. They would have, by the time they reached London, decided that he had gone home by another route. They would, in time, by Hedwig's careful old practice, receive letters from him at intervals through the summer, in his small, precise hand, telling them small things about a hall they were not, on the whole, allowed to be told about, and they would write back. They would, in the next term, have him in their library again, at the long table by the window, working through their homework slow. In Olympus, Persephone would receive, by Hermes that afternoon, the long old letter she had been waiting for, and she would read it, and she would set it down, and she would smile the small contained smile she gave, on rare occasions, to news that was, on the whole, good news. Hades would draft, by the evening, a small careful protest on a slab of pale stone. The protest was, on close reading, almost entirely a thanks dressed in protest clothing, and the protest would, on the next solstice, be delivered to Elgidnir, where Hel of Helheim would read it, and would inscribe a small careful reply in her own slow hand. In a forest in Albania, by then, the column of dark smoke would have drifted, slow, into the upper branches of a tree it had, on the whole, drifted into for 10 years. The column was, by all accounts, smaller than it had been on its arrival. The column was, by all accounts, less easy to settle in itself. The column would, in the years to come, attempt fresh measures. The fresh measures would be slow. The slowness would, by his ward mother's careful estimation, give them all on the whole time. At the gate of Elgidnir, Harry, with the half hand that was bone on his right shoulder and the half hand that was flesh on his left, walked through into the long old hall in which he had been raised. The cold wind did not, on the whole, blow. The held light gathered at the corners. The dead, by the slow, careful old practice they had been keeping, stood. The 8 children in the corner set down their game. "Welcome home, child," said Hel of Helheim. "I am glad to be home, mother." The hall went on. Chapter 7 End.